December 26th, 1943. 4:50 in the afternoon. Deep in the Barents Sea, the darkness is absolute. Arctic night wraps around everything like a frozen shroud. The wind screams across heaving black waves. Driving snow cuts visibility to almost nothing. Aboard the British battleship HMS Duke of York, every man is at action stations. Admiral Bruce Fraser stands on the bridge, watching the radar screen with predatory focus. His gunners have been tracking their target for minutes. Range, just under 6 nautical miles. The enemy has no idea they're here. 2 minutes earlier, HMS Belfast fired star shells high into the storm. Now brilliant white magnesium light bleeds through the darkness. And there, suddenly visible in that artificial dawn, is the German battleship Scharnhorst. She's caught completely unprepared. Her main gun turrets are trained fore and aft, useless for immediate action. Her crew scrambles desperately as they realize what's happening. They've sailed straight into a trap. Duke of York's 14-inch guns roar. The salvo is devastating. Shells weighing 1,600 pounds each, over 700 kilograms of hardened steel, smash into Scharnhorst's superstructure. Her forward turrets are hit, disabled almost immediately. Heavy casualties. Steel screams. Fire erupts along her decks. This is the beginning of the end for one of Germany's most feared warships. But how did we get here? To understand how Scharnhorst came to be trapped in the Arctic darkness that December night, we need to go back. Back to the shipyards of northern Germany. Back to the ambitions of a nation rebuilding its military might. Back to the birth of a warship that would terrorize the Atlantic. This is Wilhelmshaven, Germany, today. The nation's primary military port. It carries echoes of proud military tradition, stretching back generations, Germany's only deep-water port on the North Sea. 80 years ago, this wasn't just a port. It was a birthplace. What today stands as an arsenal for the Bundesmarine, Germany's modern navy, was once a sprawling shipyard. Here, military vessels had been constructed since the 1870s. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all had taken shape on these slipways. In 1935, the keel plates were laid for something special. A class leader, a new generation of German battleship. She would be named for Gerhard von Scharnhorst, a Prussian general who died in 1813 during the Napoleonic Wars, a man who embodied military valor and sacrifice. The vessel would go on to become one of the most feared hunters of the North Atlantic Ocean. Her name was Scharnhorst. To understand why Germany was building battleships at all in 1935, we need to understand what came before. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed Germany's military aspirations after the First World War. The victorious Allies weren't taking chances. They imposed stringent restrictions on the post-war German navy. Restrictions designed to ensure Germany could never again challenge British naval supremacy. Personnel was limited to just 15,000 men across all roles. That's less than the crew of a handful of capital ships. The real teeth, though, were in the construction limits. Ship displacement, the weight of water a vessel pushes aside, the true measure of its size, was restricted to 10,000 tons. Gun caliber was capped at 11 inches, or 280 millimeters. These weren't arbitrary numbers. They were calculated to keep Germany's navy weak. 10,000 tons meant Germany could build cruisers, not battleships. 11-inch guns meant firepower, yes, though not the kind that could threaten Britain's capital ships. For a nation that had once challenged Britain for control of the seas, it was humiliating. Germany's naval architects, however, were clever. In the late 1920s, they designed something unprecedented, the Deutschland class, a trio of capital ships that aimed to maximize every loophole in the Treaty of Versailles. Officially, these ships displaced 10,000 tons, the treaty limit respected to the letter. Except they didn't. In reality, the Deutschland class exceeded the treaty figures by varying margins depending on how you measured. Standard displacement ranged from roughly 10,600 to 12,300 long tons. Full load displacement reached even higher, up to 16,000 long tons for Admiral Graf Spee. They were equipped with 6 powerful 11-inch main guns, the maximum allowed caliber, mounted in 2 triple turrets that gave them the broadside of a battleship. They emerged as a hybrid class. Technically, heavy cruisers. The English-speaking world, though, knew them by another name, pocket battleships. Battleship-grade armament mounted on a cruiser-sized frame. It was the shot heard around the world. The inception of the Deutschland class ignited a fierce European naval arms race. Learning of the German plans, France initiated construction of 2 battleships armed with 13-inch guns as a counter. Germany had to answer back. By 1933, the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, began envisioning a superior class of fast battleship. Something that could outgun the French response. Something that could hunt down enemy cruisers and merchants while outrunning anything powerful enough to sink it. The result was a pair of well-equipped hunters, Scharnhorst, and her sister ship, Gneisenau. Originally, they would have been completely illegal. Their size, a massive displacement of 32,000 tons, flew in the face of the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in 1935, everything changed. Adolf Hitler signed an agreement with the British on June 18, 1935, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. The accord allowed Germany a naval tonnage up to 35% that of Britain's, with individual battleships not surpassing 35,000 tons. The agreement legitimized the construction of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. What the British weren't to know was that the formal ordering process had begun already, a year earlier, before the agreement was even signed. Germany had been planning this all along. Scharnhorst was Germany's debut in the fast battleship category, and for that task she was impressively equipped. Her main armament featured 3 huge turrets, each fitted with triple upgraded 11-inch guns, 9 barrels in total, all capable of firing in broadside. The caliber was interesting. As far as battleships went, 11 inches was relatively small, not much bigger than the guns found on heavy cruisers. Most modern battleships carried 14-inch, 15-inch, or even 16-inch guns. Opting for these 11-inch weapons, though, ensured construction remained on schedule. Plans existed to rearm her with larger 15-inch guns later, the same weapons planned for future battleships. Those guns weren't ready yet, and Germany wanted Scharnhorst in service quickly. The smaller guns simplified construction and kept the schedule moving. Scharnhorst also employed lessons taken from the earlier Deutschland class. While forward-thinking, the diesel engines of the Deutschland class had been problematic, plagued by teething troubles and mechanical unreliability. Scharnhorst employed the more trusted, high-pressure steam turbine plant, combining the benefits of weight saving and proven reliability. The ship was launched in October 1936 and commissioned in January 1939. Her dimensions were nothing short of impressive. Steaming out for her first sea trials, she must have been a proud sight for the workers of Wilhelmshaven. Scharnhorst spanned a length of 771 feet, 235 meters, with a beam of 98 feet, or 30 meters. Her full load displacement surpassed 37,000 tons. This was the new generation of warship Germany had been looking for. She wasn't perfect, though. During the spring and early summer of 1939, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau underwent a rigorous period of training and working up. Crews practiced gunnery, damage control, navigation in formation. The ships were put through their paces. By June, tests unveiled several serious issues. The most critical was their tendency to take on water. The ships had been designed with a low, slim silhouette. It made them difficult targets. A smaller profile meant fewer hits in battle. It also meant, however, that the forward end would often be half submerged in the ocean, even in moderate seas. The bows had been straight-stemmed and squat. Water broke directly over them, flooding the forward sections and making the foremost gun turrets nearly unusable in anything beyond calm conditions. The solution was radical surgery. During 1939, the bows were completely reshaped, what became known as the Atlantic bow modification. They received a clipper-style curve and a sharp upward flare, the kind of graceful, swooping design you'd see on a fast ocean liner. The anchors were moved from their traditional position in the hull to sit on top of the deck, further raising the profile. Even these modifications didn't totally fix the issue. For the rest of the ship's careers, in conditions even slightly choppier than a calm sea, the forward turrets of both vessels frequently got drenched. They were often trained afterward, pointed backwards, in a futile attempt to avoid the onslaught of water crashing over the bow. Despite these slight issues, the ships were a huge boost to Germany's relatively small surface fleet. Their introduction to service couldn't have been better timed. The modifications were finished, and the ships were ready just 2 months after the Nazi war machine commenced its assault on Poland. Britain, France, and their allies stood against them. The costliest conflict in modern history had begun. Scharnhorst would go immediately to war. The steel Leviathan would need an equally steely commander if she would ever do any damage to the enemy. Fortunately, the German Navy had just the right man. Scharnhorst's first commander had been beloved by the crew. Captain Otto Ciliax deeply respected his ship and her crew, and they respected him back. Under his leadership, Scharnhorst had completed her trials and modifications, worked up to combat readiness, and forged herself into a fighting unit. Ciliax had overseen every detail: gunnery practice, damage control drills, the careful integration of 1,600 men into a single, functioning organism. The demands of the war effort, however, needed him elsewhere. He'd been promoted to Rear Admiral, given command of larger operations. It left a vacancy. The right man would need to step in and assume command of the ship on her maiden wartime sortie. On September 21st, 1939, a confident figure strode onto the ship's decks for the first time as her new commander. He was a veteran of the sea, an old hand who had started out way back in 1912 as a midshipman and climbed the ranks through years of hard service. He had big shoes to fill. If anyone could do it, though, it was him. His name was Kurt Caesar Hoffmann. Transitioning from the leadership of a revered figure like Ciliax might have been challenging for many commanders. The crew had genuine affection for their first captain. They'd formed bonds, established routines, built trust. Hoffmann rose to the occasion. While there were initial reservations among the crew about how he would compare to Ciliax, Hoffmann's strong leadership skills, dedication to duty, and genuine concern for his men quickly won them over. He wasn't trying to be Ciliax. He was his own man, disciplined yet fair, demanding yet respectful. Hoffmann not only managed to uphold the standards set by Ciliax, he also carved out his own esteemed place within the ranks of the Scharnhorst crew. He would oversee 56 officers and over 1,600 ratings. Engineers who kept the massive steam turbines running. Gunners who could put shells on target at 20,000 yards. Cooks who fed the crew 3 meals a day. Sailors who maintained the ship, stood watch, manned damage control stations. They all combined to turn Scharnhorst from an impressive engineering achievement into a living, breathing thing. A floating town and a terrifying weapon, all in one. The crew began to develop their own identity, their own traditions, their own sense of pride in the ship they served. They adopted a motto, a personal mantra that would follow Scharnhorst throughout her career. Scharnhorst immer vorwärts. Scharnhorst ever onwards. It captured something essential about the ship and her crew, a sense of momentum, of relentless forward motion. No matter what obstacles lay ahead, Scharnhorst would press on. Under Hoffmann's command, they would get their first chance to prove it. They set out for the first time in November 1939 with orders to slip through the British blockade and into the North Atlantic, where they could hunt with virtual impunity. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau slipped out of Wilhelmshaven on November 21, 1939, with a simple goal. Their fleet mate, the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, was being hunted in the South Atlantic. British warships were closing in, trying to track her down and sink her. The pair of newer German ships would slip through the British blockade and out into the North Atlantic Ocean. News of their escape would draw British units northward, easing the pressure on Graf Spee. It was a dangerous mission. The pair steamed north, and Hoffmann knew it was a treacherous exercise. One wrong move could put them on a course to meet the formidable Royal Navy Home Fleet head-on. For all their strengths, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would be hopelessly outgunned by the larger warships of the Royal Navy, ships like Nelson and Rodney with their 16-inch guns, or the battle cruisers Hood and Renown. The German ships' strength lay in their speed and the danger they posed to Allied merchant shipping. It would force the Royal Navy to take them seriously as a threat, yet make them incredibly difficult to catch. As they sailed for the first time toward the open ocean, threading the gap between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, Hoffmann and his crew couldn't have known that they would blood their guns much sooner than they expected. That first day at sea, steaming through the cold North Atlantic, they chanced upon a British vessel. It was the armed merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi. She was hardly a warship in the true sense. Rawalpindi had started life as a passenger liner, one of the P&O Company's ships that had plied routes to India and the Far East in peacetime. When war came, the Royal Navy requisitioned her and fitted her with guns. Old 6-inch deck guns from the First World War, bolted to her superstructure. 8 of them in total, manually aimed and fired. She was what the British called an armed merchant cruiser, a glorified passenger liner pressed into service as a patrol vessel. Useful for stopping and searching merchant ships, escorting convoys in quiet sectors, showing the flag. Against a modern battleship, though, she didn't stand a chance. On Scharnhorst's bridge, Hoffmann hoped to capture the ship and give her crew a chance at life. The Germans flashed a series of warnings, their signal lamps cutting through the grey afternoon. Stop. Heave to. Abandon ship. To their surprise, the British vessel turned and faced them. Her captain, Edward Coverley Kennedy, had decided to stand and fight. It was a brave decision. A futile one, yet brave nonetheless. Kennedy knew his ship was outmatched. He knew that Rawalpindi's thin hull plating and ancient guns gave him virtually no hope of victory. He also knew his duty, though, to delay the German ships, to get off a distress signal, to buy time for heavier British units to respond. Rawalpindi's guns opened fire. The duel was hopelessly one-sided. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's 11-inch guns replied, and within minutes Rawalpindi was ablaze. Shells tore through her superstructure, detonating deep inside the ship. Fires spread rapidly through the wooden panelling and furnishings left over from her passenger liner days. To her credit, Rawalpindi managed to score at least one hit on Scharnhorst. It did little to no damage. The shell struck the thick armour belt and bounced off, leaving only a scar on the steel. Still, it was something. A mark of defiance. Within 40 minutes, the German duo had obliterated Rawalpindi. She was sinking on November 23, 1939, burning from stem to stern. Captain Kennedy went down with his ship. Of the 271 men aboard, only 38 would survive. Scharnhorst's guns had been blooded. It had been an inglorious victory, though there was no honour in smashing a converted passenger liner. Hoffmann ordered his ships to stop and retrieve survivors. Then the lookout spotted something on the horizon that made his blood run cold. The approach of British warships. Rawalpindi's distress calls had been heard. A leading force of cruisers from the British home fleet had arrived on station to tail the German ships until the main force could catch up, hunt them down, and destroy them. Hoffmann sensed the danger immediately. If the home fleet's battleships arrived, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would be trapped. Fortune was on his side, though. A rain squall blew in, one of those sudden North Atlantic storms that turns day into night in minutes. It covered Scharnhorst and Gneisenau as they made full steam for safety, using the poor visibility to slip away. The British forces just couldn't hope to catch them. By the time the weather cleared, the German ships were long gone. They'd escaped. The inclement weather proved just as damaging to the Germans as it had been beneficial, however. In the North Sea, the sister ships encountered seas so heavy they both took on significant damage. Water crashed over the bows, those same bows that had just been modified, flooding forward compartments and straining the hull. Equipment was damaged, men were injured. Both ships had to steam home for repairs. They arrived back at Wilhelmshaven battered yet intact. The mission had been a partial success. They'd drawn British attention northward, though whether it helped Graf Spee was questionable. More importantly, Scharnhorst had proven herself in combat. Her guns worked. Her crew functioned under fire. Captain Hoffmann had commanded well. The legend of the lucky ship was beginning to take shape. During the chilly winter of 1939 to 1940, Scharnhorst remained mostly dormant, undergoing maintenance and overhaul in Wilhelmshaven. The crew drilled, trained, prepared. Ice formed on the ship's superstructure. Men bundled in heavy coats stood watch on windswept decks. They waited for their next mission. By April the next year, she, alongside most of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet, was mobilized to support one of the most audacious operations of the early war: the occupation of Norway and Denmark. Operation Weserübung, Exercise Weser, was a massive undertaking. Germany would invade neutral Norway and Denmark simultaneously, securing the iron ore route from Sweden and denying the Allies strategic positions in Scandinavia. The operation required precise coordination across hundreds of miles of coastline. Multiple landing groups would strike simultaneously at ports from Oslo in the south to Narvik in the far north. The Royal Navy would certainly respond, and respond hard. Under the command of Admiral Günther Lütjens, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were designated to provide distant cover for the landings. They were accompanied by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 10 destroyers carrying approximately 1,900 mountain troops for the assault on Narvik. The plan was straightforward. The battleships would shield the invasion force from interference by the British Home Fleet. If heavy British units tried to intervene, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would engage them long enough for the transports to complete their mission. It was a dangerous assignment. The Home Fleet was powerful, well-positioned, and alert. If things went wrong, the German ships could find themselves trapped between the British battleships and the Norwegian coast. In the North Sea, the British Royal Navy quickly detected this formidable German force. The Home Fleet scrambled to intercept. On April 9, 1940, after a skirmish between Admiral Hipper and British destroyers, the battlecruiser HMS Renown engaged Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in heavy weather. The conditions were brutal. Storm-force winds whipped the sea into a frenzy. Rain and spray reduced visibility to mere hundreds of yards at times. Both sides struggled to find their range through the murk. Renown was outnumbered 2-1, yet she fought aggressively. Her captain, Charles Simeon, had no intention of letting the German ships pass unchallenged. Her 15-inch guns could punch through Scharnhorst's armour if they hit. The German ships had to respect that firepower. For an extended period, sources vary on the exact duration, though it lasted long enough for both sides to score hits. The ships exchanged fire through the storm. Renown's gunnery was hampered by the weather, yet she managed to hit Gneisenau's forward fire control position, damaging crucial targeting equipment. Shells from both German ships straddled the British battlecruiser, sending up massive columns of water. Scharnhorst took hits that caused minor flooding. More worryingly, the turbine problems that had appeared during trials returned during the engagement. One of the turbine units experienced significant issues, reducing her maximum speed. The engagement proved inconclusive. Neither side had gained a decisive advantage. Renown had inflicted damage on both German ships, particularly Gneisenau's fire control systems. The Germans had hit Renown hard enough to cause flooding and casualties. Lütjens made the decision to disengage. Even with turbine problems, the German ships could still make better speed than Renown in the heavy seas. They used that advantage to pull away from the British battlecruiser in the storm, disappearing into the murk. They returned to Wilhelmshaven that evening for repairs. The operation had been a close call. Scharnhorst had faced a worthy opponent in heavy seas and come away damaged. The crew had learned valuable lessons about fighting in Atlantic conditions, lessons paid for in blood and steel. More importantly, they'd learned that their ship had vulnerabilities. The turbines could fail at critical moments. The low freeboard still caused severe problems in rough seas. The forward turrets had been swamped repeatedly, their crews working in waist-deep water as waves crashed over the bow. These were issues that would need addressing before the next sortie. The Norwegian campaign had been a strategic success overall. Germany secured its objectives despite fierce British and Norwegian resistance. Scharnhorst had played her part, even if the engagement with Renown had been inconclusive. After repairs, she would get another chance to prove herself. That chance would come sooner than anyone expected. In June 1940, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were hunting together again, steaming off the coast of Norway in support of German forces still fighting in the north. Operation Juno, a mission to disrupt Allied operations around Harstad and demonstrate German naval dominance in Norwegian waters. They were patrolling the Norwegian Sea on June 8th, when lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. At first, the Germans weren't sure what they'd found. A convoy, perhaps. Merchant ships with destroyer escorts. Something they could attack and sink before heavier British units arrived. As they closed the range, however, the smoke resolved into something unexpected. The British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious was steaming southward with 2 destroyer escorts, HMS Ardent and HMS Acasta. This would prove a devastating engagement for the British. It would also serve as a demonstration of what these 2 ferocious German warships were actually capable of when facing lighter opposition. HMS Glorious was no match for battleships. She was a carrier designed to launch and recover aircraft, not to fight surface actions with heavy guns. Her flight deck was vulnerable, essentially a large wooden platform sitting atop a hull with minimal armour protection. Her defensive armament consisted of a handful of 4.7-inch guns, utterly inadequate for this kind of fight. Worse, most of her aircraft were stowed below decks. She'd been evacuating RAF Hurricanes and Gladiators from Norway, and her hangar was packed with planes that couldn't be launched quickly enough to matter. The 2 destroyers were even more outmatched. HMS Ardent and HMS Acasta were brave ships crewed by brave men, armed with 4.7-inch guns and torpedo tubes. Against 28-centimetre battleship guns, however, they were hopelessly outclassed. Aboard Glorious, Captain Guy Doyley Hughes faced an impossible situation. His ship couldn't outrun the German battleships. Glorious could make 30 knots at best, while the German ships could sustain 32 knots even with their earlier damage. He couldn't fight them, his guns couldn't reach them, and his aircraft couldn't launch fast enough. His only hope was that his destroyer escorts could buy him enough time to escape. HMS Ardent rushed forward to cover Glorious with a smoke screen. Black oil smoke poured from her funnels as she pushed her boilers to maximum capacity. She fired torpedoes toward the German ships, white wakes streaking across the dark water, and poured supporting gunfire onto them in desperate attempts to buy time for the carrier to escape. The 4.7-inch shells fell short at first, then found the range. One shell actually hit Scharnhorst. It simply bounced off the thick armour belt, doing no damage beyond a scar on the steel. A mark of defiance, nothing more. The Germans' 28-centimetre guns fired back. The effect was devastating. Each German shell weighed over 700 pounds. When they struck Ardent's thin hull plating, they punched through like paper before detonating inside the ship. The explosions were catastrophic, tearing apart bulkheads, igniting ammunition, killing men by the dozens. Ardent was shattered by gunfire that left her dead in the water within minutes. Fires consumed her superstructure, spreading rapidly through the wooden fittings and painted surfaces. Her hull was riddled with holes, water pouring into compartments faster than the pumps could handle. She was sinking. Before she went down, her crew launched one final spread of torpedoes from the disabled ship. Every torpedo missed, passing harmlessly astern of the German battleships. Of Ardent's entire crew of 175 men, only 2 would survive the sinking and the freezing Norwegian Sea. With Ardent neutralized, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau trained their main batteries on Glorious and got to work. The carrier tried desperately to run, working up to her maximum speed of 30 knots. She launched what aircraft she could, a handful of swordfish biplanes that circled helplessly, unable to stop battleships with their light bombs and torpedoes. Some pilots made brave but futile attacks, dropping their weapons before the German fighters shot them down, or they ran out of fuel and ditched in the sea. The range closed steadily. The German ship's longer legs meant escape was impossible. At approximately 5:40 in the afternoon, the German battleships opened fire on Glorious from extreme range. The first salvos fell short, sending up towering columns of water alongside the carrier. The German gunners adjusted their aim, walking their fire closer with each salvo. Then they found the range. Just an hour and a half later, Glorious was blazing from stem to stern, listing heavily in the water. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's shells had torn through her flight deck and plunged into the hangar spaces below, where the tightly packed aircraft created a death trap. Aviation fuel ignited in massive fireballs. Ammunition cooked off in chain reactions. The fires spread uncontrollably through the ship, overwhelming the damage control teams. She finally sank around 1810, taking hundreds of men with her into the cold Norwegian Sea. HMS Acasta had tried to maintain a smokescreen with some effect, obscuring the German ship's view and buying precious minutes for Glorious. Her captain, Charles Glassford, had watched Ardent die fighting. He'd watched Glorious burn and sink. Now his ship was the only British vessel left, with nowhere to run and no hope of escape. He knew his ship was doomed. He also knew his duty. Glassford ordered a torpedo attack. Acasta charged through her own smokescreen, closing the range to the German battleships at maximum speed. Her torpedo tubes swung toward the targets. The crew loaded, aimed, fired, with practiced efficiency born of countless drills. A volley of torpedoes surged through the water toward Scharnhorst at 40 knots. Most missed, passing ahead or astern of the German battleship as she manoeuvred. One didn't. It slammed home into Scharnhorst's starboard side, just aft of the midship section, and exploded with tremendous force. The blast tore a massive hole below the waterline, approximately 40 feet long and 15 feet high. Water poured into multiple compartments, boiler rooms, fuel bunkers, storage spaces. The ship took on a noticeable list to starboard as thousands of tons of seawater flooded in. Damage control teams rushed to contain the flooding, racing through passageways already ankle-deep in water. They shored up bulkheads with wooden beams, sealed watertight doors, activated emergency pumps. The turbine problems that had plagued Scharnhorst during the Renown engagement returned. One of the turbine units was knocked offline by the shock of the torpedo hit, reducing her speed significantly. Scharnhorst had been badly hurt. Acasta didn't survive to see the full extent of the damage she'd inflicted. The German battleships turned their concentrated fire on the lone destroyer. Shell after shell smashed into Acasta until she was nothing more than a burning, listing wreck. Her guns fell silent one by one as the crews were killed or the weapons disabled. She sank around 1820, taking Captain Glassford and most of her crew with her. From the entire engagement, only about 40 British sailors survived out of approximately 1,519 men killed or missing across all three ships. It was a devastating catastrophe for the Royal Navy, a fleet carrier and 2 destroyers lost in a single afternoon. Years later, it would come to light that British intelligence had indications that Scharnhorst and Gneisenau might be at sea. Signals intelligence and analysis had produced warnings that German heavy units could be operating in the area. These warnings, however, were not effectively passed through the operational chain of command or acted upon at the Admiralty level. Glorious was never adequately notified of the threat. She'd sailed straight into the German battleships with no idea they were hunting in those waters. The intelligence failure would be the subject of bitter controversy and official inquiries for years to come. For Hoffmann and his men aboard Scharnhorst, it was a resounding tactical victory. 3 British warships sunk, including a valuable fleet carrier that represented years of construction and training. The propaganda value alone was enormous. The ship had been nearly crippled by Acasta's torpedo hit, though. They limped for home, down one turbine, taking on water, listing several degrees to starboard. The damage control teams worked around the clock to keep her afloat, fighting a constant battle against the flooding. Every pump ran at maximum capacity. Every watertight door was secured and checked repeatedly. Men stood watch in flooded compartments, monitoring the water level and the stressed bulkheads. She made it back to Germany. The crew received a hero's welcome despite the severe torpedo damage. They'd sunk a British carrier, a major propaganda victory that German newspapers and radio broadcasts trumpeted for weeks. They'd proven Scharnhorst could take punishment and keep fighting, could survive a direct torpedo hit and make it home. Despite the near-crippling damage, the ship had inflicted a terrible toll on the British. The crew's belief in their ship's fortunes was growing. The propaganda machine was working overtime to build the myth. Part fact, part wishful thinking. Scharnhorst was beginning to earn a reputation as the Kriegsmarine's lucky ship. The legend was taking shape. The next summer, after months of extensive repairs and refit, the 2 sister ships, repaired, refreshed and ready, were prepared to break out into the open ocean once again. Operation Berlin. This time, they would focus on what they'd been designed for all along, hunting down Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic and demonstrating what they were truly capable of against vulnerable targets. Once more under Admiral Günther Lütjen's command, the 2 ships prepared for a major commerce raiding mission that would last months. Lütjens was an experienced officer, methodical and cautious by nature. He understood the value of the ships under his command. Germany couldn't afford to lose capital ships in pointless battles, and he wasn't about to throw them away fighting British battleships when merchants were the real target. From January 22nd to March 22nd, 1941, the sister ships wreaked havoc in the Atlantic. They operated as a deadly team, working together to locate convoys, isolate stragglers, and systematically sink merchant vessels. The tactics were simple yet effective. Find a convoy, identify the weakest escorts, strike fast, sink what they could, and disappear before heavier British units arrived. 22 merchant vessels were sunk or captured during the operation, totaling over 115,000 tons of shipping destroyed. It was a staggering success by any measure. Their presence heavily disrupted the vital Allied convoy system that Britain depended on for survival. The British were forced to divert precious escorts from other duties, weakening protection across multiple routes. Convoys were rerouted on massive detours, adding days or weeks to their journeys and straining fuel supplies. Merchant sailors lived in constant fear of encountering the German battleships. Every smoke plume on the horizon could be death approaching at 30 knots. The psychological impact was nearly as damaging as the actual tonnage sunk. The Germans had proven that their fast battleships could operate in the Atlantic with relative impunity. Despite their strength and their success, however, Lütjens consistently avoided engagements with British battleships. He opted for extreme caution, disengaging on 3 distinct occasions when heavier British warships appeared on the horizon. His orders were crystal clear: sink merchants, avoid battles with capital ships. The goal was to disrupt Allied shipping and tie down British naval forces, not to fight the Royal Navy's battleships in single combat that could end with German ships on the bottom. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau weren't designed to stand toe-to-toe with ships carrying 15-inch or 16-inch guns. Their 28-centimetre weapons gave them an overwhelming advantage over cruisers and merchants, certainly. Against true battleships like Nelson, Rodney, or the new King George V class, however, they were outgunned and would likely lose a sustained engagement. Lütjens' caution kept them alive and fighting throughout the operation. By late March, both vessels reached the safety of Brest in occupied France, docking on the 23rd under heavy fighter cover provided by the Luftwaffe. They'd completed one of the most successful commerce raiding operations of the war to that point. The Atlantic had proven to be rich hunting grounds. The crew's pride in their ship and their belief in her luck was solidified. Being stationed in Brest would pose significant challenges, however. Over the subsequent months, the British launched relentless attacks, attempting to neutralise the German battleships docked there. RAF bombers came night after night in growing numbers. Wellingtons, Halifaxes, Stirlings, Hamptons, they all took turns dropping bombs on the French port in determined efforts to sink or disable the German ships. The Germans built massive concrete bunkers to shelter the vessels, reinforced structures with roofs several metres thick that could withstand direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs. The crews lived in constant tension and exhaustion. Air raid sirens became part of daily life, wailing several times each night. Sleep was interrupted by the drone of British bombers overhead and the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. The concussion of near-miss bombs shook the ships even inside their protective bunkers. In June 1941, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were joined by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, which docked after her ill-fated mission accompanying the German battleship Bismarck. Bismarck's fate weighed heavily on everyone's minds. She'd been hunted down and sunk by overwhelming Royal Navy forces in May after sinking HMS Hood in the Denmark Strait. The British had committed virtually their entire home fleet to the chase: battleships, battle cruisers, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and had run Bismarck to ground in the Atlantic. It was a stark reminder of what could happen to German capital ships caught in the open ocean by superior British forces, with the determination to destroy them. The three ships couldn't remain in Brest indefinitely. The RAF bombing was intensifying, and the risk of catastrophic damage was growing with each raid. To ensure the ships' safety and position them within range of better air defence coverage, it was decided to relocate them all to Germany. This would be no easy task whatsoever. They would need to sail right under the noses of the British, through the English Channel itself, the most heavily defended waters in the world. In February 1942, during what the Germans termed Operation Cerberus, named for the mythological three-headed dog guarding the gates of the underworld, all three vessels daringly navigated through the English Channel in broad daylight. The Channel Dash, as it became known to the British public, was one of the most audacious naval operations of the entire war. The narrowest point of the English Channel, the Strait of Dover, is just 21 miles wide. The British had radar stations watching those waters around the clock. They had patrol boats, aircraft, mines laid in defensive fields, coastal guns positioned at strategic points. An entire defensive network had been built to prevent exactly this kind of German breakthrough. The German plan relied on surprise, overwhelming speed, and massive fighter cover from the Luftwaffe. They would race through the channel at maximum speed under a protective umbrella of German fighters, flying in relays, breaking through before the British could organise an effective response with sufficient force to stop them. The operation began before dawn on February 12th. The three ships slipped out of Brest under cover of darkness, their departure timed to bring them through the narrowest part of the channel during daylight when Luftwaffe fighter cover would be strongest. The British were caught completely by surprise. Radar operators detected the ships, yes. Reports came in from various sources. The information didn't coalesce quickly enough, however, and the response was piecemeal and uncoordinated. British motor torpedo boats attacked, but were driven off by German escorts and fighters. RAF bombers tried to strike the ships, but faced overwhelming fighter opposition and achieved few hits. The Royal Navy launched what forces it had available, including a brave but doomed charge by 6 old Swordfish torpedo bombers that were all shot down without scoring a single hit. Despite sustaining some damage from mines, both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau struck mines that caused flooding and required damage control efforts. All three vessels successfully reached German waters. For the Germans, it was an enormous propaganda triumph. They'd sailed 3 major warships through the English Channel in daylight and gotten away with it, making the Royal Navy look impotent. For the British, it was a monumental embarrassment that sparked public fury. This audacious move led to widespread outrage in Britain, especially given that these ships had been operating so close to British shores, practically in their backyard, steaming through what should have been the most secure waters under British control. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was furious. He ordered a formal inquiry into how the Royal Navy and RAF had allowed this to happen, demanding answers for what appeared to be a catastrophic failure of intelligence and coordination. In some ways for the British, however, it was a blessing in disguise. Once back in German waters, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's threat to the Atlantic convoys had diminished significantly. They were no longer positioned to strike at the vital sea lanes, bringing supplies from America to Britain. The convoys could breathe easier, knowing the German battleships were bottled up in the Baltic and North Sea. Soon after docking in Kiel that same month, Gneisenau suffered catastrophic damage from British bombers that would end her career as a functioning warship. An RAF raid in late February struck the port, and Gneisenau took a direct hit from a heavy bomb that penetrated her armoured deck and detonated deep inside the ship. The explosion caused devastating damage to her forward sections, destroying internal compartments and weakening the hull structure. Though there were plans to repair her and possibly rearm her with the larger 15-inch guns originally intended for the class, the damage was so severe and the resources so strained that the work was never completed. She was relocated to Gotenhafen, modern-day Gdynia in occupied Poland, in April 1942. She was eventually decommissioned, and parts of her main armament were removed and emplaced as coastal batteries. She would later be used as a block ship, scuttled to deny port facilities to advancing Soviet forces. Scharnhorst was truly on her own now. Her sister ship was gone. Bismarck had been sunk. The surface fleet that Germany had worked so hard to build was being whittled away. Scharnhorst would have to carry the legend of the lucky ship alone. By 1942, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. The Atlantic was becoming too dangerous for German surface raiders. Allied air power was growing stronger. Escort carriers were beginning to appear with convoys. The Royal Navy had learned hard lessons and was adapting. Scharnhorst needed a new hunting ground. In March 1943, after multiple attempts to break through British air and naval surveillance, Scharnhorst finally reached Norway. She docked on March 14th at Bogen Bay near Narvik, joining other German warships already sheltering in the remote anchorages and fjords of the far north. Norway already harboured the formidable battleship Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, and now the largest operational battleship in the German fleet. A selection of cruisers and destroyers were also moored in various anchorages, all seeking refuge from Allied air assaults and fuel shortages that were beginning to cripple German naval operations. Scharnhorst would operate from the Altafjord and Kofjord areas where the massive Tirpitz was based. The setting was beautiful in its own stark way. Steep mountains rose directly from the water, their peaks snow-capped year-round. The fjords themselves were deep and well protected from both aerial observation and submarine attack. Camouflage netting stretched across the anchorages, making the ships nearly invisible from above. For the crews, however, it was exile. Life in these remote Norwegian anchorages was monotonous and isolating in ways that tested even the most disciplined sailors. The camaraderie between the two ships' crews was virtually non-existent. In fact, tensions ran high between them from the start. Crew memoirs and later historians would recall how Scharnhorst's seasoned crew, veterans of multiple combat actions, survivors of the glorious engagement, the Atlantic raids, the Channel Dash, viewed themselves as the real fighting sailors of the Kriegsmarine. They'd bloodied their guns repeatedly. They'd taken hits and survived. They'd earned their reputation through combat. Tirpitz, despite being the flagship and the most powerful ship in the German fleet, had never fought a major surface action. She'd conducted a few sorties, yes, bombarded some shore positions, certainly. She'd never faced enemy battleships in a guns-blazing duel, though. She'd never hunted convoys in the Atlantic. She'd never taken a torpedo hit and limped home barely afloat. According to accounts from Scharnhorst's crew, they perceived Tirpitz's sailors as untested, sailors who'd never truly proven themselves in the kind of desperate combat that forges fighting ships. The perception was unfair in many ways. Tirpitz's crew trained hard and maintained their ship to high standards. The strategic reality was that Tirpitz was too valuable to risk in combat. Her mere presence in Norwegian waters tied down significant British naval forces that had to be positioned to counter her if she sortied. The fleet-in-being strategy meant Tirpitz accomplished her mission simply by existing as a threat. Scharnhorst's crew didn't care about strategic theory, however. They cared about who'd actually fought and bled. The tensions were exacerbated by Tirpitz's captain, Hans Meyer. He was known throughout the fleet for his strict discipline, some would say excessively strict, even by the rigid standards of the German Navy. Meyer ran his ship with an iron fist. Minor infractions brought harsh punishments. He demanded absolute obedience and showed little patience for the kind of informal camaraderie that often developed among long-serving crews. Post-war accounts and crew memoirs suggest he earned little respect from either crew for his approach. Many viewed him as overly authoritarian, more concerned with regulations than with the welfare of his men or the practical realities of keeping morale high in such isolated conditions. Despite tensions with the flagship, morale aboard Scharnhorst stayed relatively good initially. The crew still had their pride in their ship. They still believed in what they called the lucky ship legend, part fact, part propaganda, part genuine hope. They still trusted their officers. As summer progressed, however, a sense of deep isolation began to settle over the crew like a fog. The region's tepid days and melting ice gave way to muddy terrain that made any movement off the ships miserable. The persistent midnight sun of the Arctic summer fostered swarms of biting insects, mosquitoes and gnats that made outdoor activities nearly unbearable. News from home became scarce and irregular. Mail took weeks or months to arrive. Letters from families told of bombing raids, food shortages, the grinding Eastern Front. The news from the battlefronts was increasingly grim. Stalingrad had been a catastrophe. North Africa was lost. The Allies were bombing German cities around the clock. The crew's weariness grew, made worse by the absence of any nearby entertainment or respite from the ship. The closest town was a trek of over 3 miles, about 5 kilometers, away through difficult terrain. Getting there required permission, which wasn't always granted. When sailors did make it to town, they found little to do. A few small shops, a church, some houses inhabited by Norwegians, who viewed the German occupation forces with cold hostility at best. Inevitably, boredom began to take hold like a creeping sickness. To counter the tedium, the crew found whatever diversions they could. Illegal gambling was widespread throughout the ship, despite official prohibitions. Card games ran constantly in crew quarters, poker, scat, any game that could pass the hours and give men something to focus on besides their isolation. Officers knew about it and mostly turned a blind eye, recognizing that some rule-breaking was preferable to having men go stir crazy from boredom. Many sailors honed their skiing skills during winter months when snow covered everything. The Norwegian landscape was perfect for it, and some men became quite proficient, racing down the mountainsides on whatever skis they could improvise or acquire. The ship's movie projector got heavy use. The limited collection of films was watched over and over until men could recite the dialogue from memory. The same newsreels, the same propaganda films, the same entertainment shorts cycled endlessly. The library filled with adventure tales and novels was always popular. Men read everything they could get their hands on: sea stories, westerns, detective novels, anything to transport their minds somewhere beyond the grey walls of the ship and the stark mountains surrounding the fjord. It was a strange existence. They were aboard one of the most powerful warships in the world, yet they spent their days skiing, gambling, and rereading old books. The war felt distant, abstract, almost unreal in this frozen corner of Norway. The monotony would be broken eventually, though in ways the crew wouldn't welcome. The crew's affection for their beloved Captain Hoffman, the man who'd led them through their first combat actions, who'd earned their trust and respect, was about to be tested by his absence. By 1942, Kurt Caesar Hoffmann's skill and leadership had been recognized throughout the Kriegsmarine. His successful command of Scharnhorst during multiple combat operations had marked him as an officer with potential for higher command. In April 1942, he was promoted to flag rank and given command of larger operational groups. For Scharnhorst's crew, it was a devastating blow. They'd served under two captains, first the beloved Ciliax, then Hoffmann, who'd proven himself worthy of filling those considerable shoes. Now they were losing Hoffmann too, just when they needed steady leadership most in their Arctic exile. His replacement arrived with credentials and experience, yet he would prove to be a poor fit for the ship and her crew. Captain Friedrich Hufmeier, sometimes spelled Hufmeier in anglicized accounts, became Scharnhorst's skipper. In stark contrast to Hoffmann's competent and respected leadership, Hufmeier's tenure would be marred by several serious mishaps that eroded the crew's confidence. The incidents that followed would become part of the ship's lore, reported in crew memoirs and post-war accounts. According to these reports, Hufmeier ran Scharnhorst aground at a blistering 26 knots during a training exercise. The impact was tremendous. The ship shuddered from bow to stern as the keel scraped across the bottom. Damage was significant, requiring time in dock for repairs to the hull plating and underwater fittings. Running aground is one of the most embarrassing things that can happen to a ship's captain. It suggests poor navigation, inadequate attention to charts and soundings, failure to maintain proper situational awareness. For it to happen at high speed made it even worse in the eyes of the crew. Later accounts describe how he managed to entangle a buoy wire around one of the ship's propeller shafts during what should have been a routine mooring operation. The wire wrapped tight around the shaft, requiring divers to go down in the freezing water to cut it free, dangerous, difficult, work that took days to complete properly. The incident that cemented his reputation came in August 1942 when, according to interrogation reports and secondary sources, he collided with the submarine U-5-23 during a training exercise. Colliding with a submarine is almost unforgivable in naval circles. Submarines are small, maneuverable, and their entire purpose involves avoiding detection and contact. For a battleship to hit one during peacetime exercises suggested serious problems with seamanship and bridge watchkeeping. Each incident resulted in extensive repairs. Each incident further damaged the crew's confidence in their captain. Each incident tarnished the reputation of what they called the lucky ship. By the end of 1942, with British and American air power growing in strength and danger with each passing month, Scharnhorst received orders to make for Norway and the relative safety of the fjords. It was a relief to be away from Hufmeier's troubled command, even if it meant exile to the Arctic. In September 1943, finally, Scharnhorst received a new captain who would begin to restore what Hufmeier had damaged. Captain Fritz Hintze arrived to assume command of the ship. Hintze had been fascinated by the sea since he was a child growing up in Germany. In 1920, as soon as he was old enough, he rushed to join the reformed German Navy in the aftermath of the First World War. He'd risen steadily through the ranks over more than 2 decades of service, learning his craft on destroyers and cruisers before being deemed ready for battleship command. Assuming command of Scharnhorst was for him the culmination of a childhood dream. Here was one of Germany's premier warships, a vessel with a combat record that included sinking a British carrier and raiding successfully in the Atlantic. To be given command of such a ship was the highest honour the Kriegsmarine could bestow. Hintze had odd tendencies that the crew quickly noticed and gossiped about. He had a habit of staying in bed until well past 10 in the morning every day. While the crew was up at dawn for their duties, the captain slept late in his cabin. Then, like clockwork, he required an afternoon nap between 1 and 3 every day. The crew was forbidden from even walking near his cabin while the captain had his afternoon nap. Men learned to tiptoe through certain sections of the ship during those hours, speaking in whispers if they had to speak at all. Any noise that disturbed the captain's rest brought swift reprimand. It was unusual behaviour, certainly. Naval captains were typically up before their crews and worked longer hours than anyone else aboard. Hintze's schedule seemed almost leisurely by comparison. Despite these eccentricities, however, the crew gradually warmed to him. While Hintze never reached the status of beloved Hoffman in the crew's estimation, he went a long way toward restoring morale after the troubled period under Hufmeier. He was competent at seamanship. The ship didn't run aground under his command, didn't collide with submarines, didn't tangle buoy wires in the propellers. He showed genuine concern for the welfare of his men, ensuring they had adequate food, medical care, and what limited recreational opportunities were available. He listened to his officers' concerns and incorporated their advice. More importantly, he seemed to understand the ship and respect her combat record. He maintained the traditions the crew valued. He didn't try to remake Scharnhorst into something she wasn't. Morale slowly improved under Hintze's command. The crew began to believe again that their ship could be effective, that their captain wouldn't squander their lives through incompetence. They would soon get a chance to prove themselves in action, even if that action would reveal troubling truths about Germany's deteriorating strategic position. In early September 1943, Scharnhorst and Tirpitz received orders for an operation that seemed designed more for propaganda value than strategic necessity. They would shell Allied shore facilities on Spitsbergen Island in the Arctic. The operation was planned as a swift propaganda victory, a demonstration that the German Navy could still project power in Arctic waters despite Allied air and naval superiority elsewhere. The battleships would sail north with a group of destroyers, bombard the island, and return to Norway before British forces could respond. On September 8th, the ships sailed north and reached Spitsbergen without incident. They approached the Allied weather station and shore facilities, their massive guns elevated and ready. The bombardment commenced. The combined weight of Scharnhorst and Tirpitz's artillery was absolutely devastating to the small installations on the island. Shells weighing hundreds of kilograms crashed into buildings, storage facilities, and radio equipment. The destruction was complete and total. As the smoke cleared, however, the Germans quickly realized the true nature of their target. The station housed only a modest group of British and Norwegian meteorologists, civilian scientists collecting weather data, and a tiny military detachment of perhaps a few dozen men at most. It was hardly a strategic target worthy of deploying 2 battleships and their escorts. The operation had been designed from the start as propaganda rather than genuine military action. Photograph the battleships firing. Report the successful destruction of an Allied installation. Hand out medals to boost morale. The medals came swiftly after their return to Norway. Tirpitz's crew received nearly 400 Iron Crosses for the operation. Scharnhorst's crew received only 160. The crew was outraged at what they perceived as a profound injustice. Both ships had participated equally in the bombardment. Both had faced the same minimal risk. There was virtually no opposition. Yet Tirpitz received more than twice as many decorations as Scharnhorst. It confirmed every suspicion Scharnhorst's crew had harboured about favouritism toward the flagship. Tirpitz was the bigger ship, yes. She was newer, certainly. She carried larger guns, true. Scharnhorst had the combat record, though. Scharnhorst had sunk enemy warships. Scharnhorst had raided in the Atlantic and survived. Scharnhorst was what they believed to be the lucky ship. The medal distribution felt like a deliberate slight, and it festered among the crew for weeks afterward. Then something happened that would change everything. On September 22nd, 1943, just 2 weeks after the Spitsbergen raid, British midget submarines attacked Tirpitz while she lay at anchor in Kofjord. The attack was audacious and brilliantly executed. Small submarines, X-craft, they were called, tiny vessels with crews of just 4 men, had been towed across hundreds of miles of ocean, and then navigated the fjords and defensive nets to reach Tirpitz's anchorage. They slipped under the anti-submarine nets, protecting the battleship, and planted massive explosive charges directly beneath her hull. The explosions that followed were tremendous. Water geysers shot hundreds of feet into the air. Tirpitz lurched violently in her moorings. The blast damage was catastrophic. Turbines knocked offline, hull plating cracked, internal compartments flooded, fire control systems wrecked. Tirpitz would survive, certainly. She was too heavily built to sink from underhull explosions alone. She would never be fully operational again, though. The damage was too severe, the repairs too complex, the resources too scarce. She would remain in Norwegian waters as a diminished threat until RAF Lancaster bombers would sink her on November 12, 1944, in Operation Catechism. With Tirpitz crippled and effectively out of the war as a fighting unit, Scharnhorst was now the last operational heavy German unit stationed in Norway. The weight of that responsibility settled on Captain Hintze and his crew. They were alone now. If the Arctic convoys were to be attacked, if British naval forces were to be challenged in these waters, it would fall to Scharnhorst. The lucky ship would have to carry the burden by herself. While Scharnhorst sat in Norwegian fjords, dealing with isolation, boredom, and command changes, the British had been planning. Admiral Bruce Fraser had been given a mission: protect the Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union at all costs, and if possible, destroy the German surface threat once and for all. Fraser's naval journey had begun way back in 1902, when he entered the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth as a young cadet. Over 4 decades, he'd risen through the ranks with a specialization in naval gunnery, the science of putting shells on target from miles away, while both ships maneuvered at high speed in challenging conditions. He'd served during the First World War aboard various ships, building his expertise in the complex mathematics and physics of naval gunfire. He'd even had a notable role during the Dardanelles operation, though training commitments had caused him to miss the Battle of Jutland, the greatest naval engagement of that war. His expertise in naval gunnery had made waves throughout the Royal Navy. By 1938, Fraser had achieved flag rank, the elevated status of admiral. During the Second World War, he'd demonstrated his strategic capabilities time and again, eventually becoming Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet. Fraser was particularly known for favouring radar-directed gunnery, a relatively new tactic that was proving especially effective during the pitch darkness of the polar nights and amidst the blinding Arctic snow squalls that could reduce visibility to 0 in minutes. For 6 months leading up to the winter of 1943, Fraser and his staff had been meticulously planning how to deal with Scharnhorst if she sortied against the convoys. They had significant advantages over their German opponents. Intelligence from Ultra, the code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park that was now taken extremely seriously by the Admiralty after earlier intelligence failures, gave them crucial insights into German intentions and movements. The Royal Navy had learned bitter lessons from Glorious and Rawalpindi. They wouldn't be caught unprepared again. Fraser developed a sophisticated three-force strategy designed to trap any German ship that ventured out to attack the convoys running supplies to the Soviet Union. Force 1 would be a cruiser squadron under the command of Vice Admiral Robert Burnett. It comprised the light cruisers HMS Belfast and HMS Sheffield, along with the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk. These ships would provide close cover for the convoys, positioned to intercept any German surface threat before it could reach the vulnerable merchant ships. Force 2 was Fraser's hammer blow, the heavy units that would deliver the killing strike if the opportunity arose. Led by his massive flagship HMS Duke of York, the force also included the heavy cruiser HMS Jamaica and 4 destroyers, HMS Savage, Saumarez, Scorpion, and the Norwegian-manned Stord. Additionally, the 36th Destroyer Division would accompany the convoys directly under Commander Ralph Fisher, providing anti-submarine screening and additional firepower if surface threats materialized. HMS Duke of York was the centerpiece of Fraser's entire plan. She was a King George V class battleship, commissioned in November 1941, one of Britain's newest and most powerful capital ships. She represented the cutting edge of British naval engineering and combat capability. She was equipped with 10 14-inch guns mounted in an unusual arrangement, 2 quadruple turrets forward and aft, and 1 twin turret forward. This configuration had been dictated by treaty limitations, but proved effective nonetheless. She boasted a full load displacement of over 42,000 tons, making her significantly larger and heavier than Scharnhorst's 37,000 tons. Duke of York was exceptionally well suited to challenge Scharnhorst, and not just because she was bigger, newer, and more heavily armed. Crucially, she was capable of firing her main guns using radar guidance, technology that the Germans simply couldn't match with anywhere near the same effectiveness. The British ship's gun batteries were enhanced with dedicated fire control radars, enabling accurate fire even beyond the visible horizon, in complete darkness through snow and fog. Her Type 273 surface search radar could detect targets nearly 25 nautical miles away, in conditions where optical rangefinders would be completely useless. Duke of York could see Scharnhorst coming from miles away and hit her accurately and reliably in complete darkness, in blinding snow, in conditions where the German ship would be effectively blind. The advantage was overwhelming. The other British vessels, the cruisers and the majority of their destroyers, were equipped with radar technology superior to that of Scharnhorst as well. The Germans would be facing an enemy that could see in the dark while they were groping blindly through the Arctic night. Fraser's tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential execution. The battleships and cruisers of the British fleet didn't directly escort the convoys. That role was designated to smaller vessels like destroyers and corvettes that could handle submarine threats more effectively and had the SOV, endurance, for extended convoy duty. However, in the event that any German surface unit threatened the Arctic convoys, the most formidable British ships from their northern bases, Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands and other anchorages could swiftly intercept. They would position themselves between the Germans and the convoy, forcing any attacker to fight through them to reach the merchants. The destroyers and lighter vessels with the convoy would delay and harass. Force 1, with its cruisers, would engage and hold contact. Force 2, with Duke of York, would close for the kill. They stood ready, ships fueled, crews at various states of readiness, waiting for Scharnhorst to make her move. The bait was prepared, convoy JW-55B, sailing from Loch Ewe in Scotland with vital supplies bound for the Soviet Union through Murmansk. Approximately 35 merchant ships loaded with tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, and all the material the Soviets desperately needed to fight the Eastern Front. If Scharnhorst took the bait and sorted to attack it, Fraser would spring his carefully prepared trap. 6 months of meticulous planning, overwhelming technological superiority in radar and fire control, intelligence advantages from ultra code breaking, superior force carefully positioned at multiple points. Everything was ready. The trap was set. The bait was in position. Now Fraser just had to wait for the Germans to sail into his carefully laid ambush. Wait for Scharnhorst to emerge from the Norwegian fjords one final time. Wait for the lucky ship's luck to finally run out. December 22nd, 1943. A German reconnaissance aircraft on routine weather patrol spotted something significant 350 miles west of Narvik. A massive Allied convoy heading eastward through the Barents Sea. The pilot's radio report climbed quickly up the chain of command. Luftwaffe headquarters, to naval operations, to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz himself. Exactly the kind of target German leadership had been waiting for. Vulnerable merchant ships laden with war material for the Soviets, sailing through waters where interception was possible. Dönitz understood the opportunity and the risk in equal measure. As Kriegsmarine Commander-in-Chief since January, he knew the surface fleet's position was precarious. Several convoys had already passed northern Norway unmolested in recent months. Hitler's patience was wearing thin. Pressure from Berlin to demonstrate the Navy's value had become intense. Stalingrad had shattered the myth of German invincibility. North Africa was lost by May. Allied bombers were pulverizing German cities around the clock. Inaction carried its own dangers. Dönitz sought Hitler's permission to deploy Scharnhorst against the next convoy navigating the Barents Sea. In deliberations with Admiral Otto Schneewind, leader of Gruppe Nord, controlling naval operations in Norway, both men recognized that doing nothing might threaten the surface fleet's continued existence more than attempting a risky operation. Schneewind had reservations, though. Tirpitz remained crippled from September's midget submarine attack. Fuel shortages limited flexibility. Luftwaffe support in the Arctic winter was virtually non-existent. No reconnaissance, no fighter cover. Persistent darkness would favour British radar-equipped ships over German vessels with inferior detection equipment. Despite these concerns, both admirals agreed some response was necessary. Political and strategic costs of inaction seemed higher than operational risks. Who would command? Vice Admiral Oskar Kumetz was the obvious choice, experienced, familiar with these operations from Tirpitz. Unavailable, however. He'd returned to Germany on sick leave after the submarine attack, his health broken by Arctic service. Konteradmiral Erich Bay stepped into the breach. Born in Hamburg, Bay entered the Navy in 1916 during the Great War. Over 2 decades, he'd built his reputation as a destroyer specialist, understanding these fast warships' capabilities and limitations better than most officers in the fleet. April 1940 found him leading the 4th Destroyer Flotilla during the Norway invasion. On the 10th and 13th, he led his ships against the Royal Navy in Narvik Fjord's confined waters. Brutal engagements, both. HMS Warspite and multiple destroyers hunting German forces trapped in the fjord. All 10 German destroyers were sunk in those 2 battles. Bay's commanding officer, Commodore Friedrich Bonte, was killed in the first engagement. Recognizing exceptional valor under impossible circumstances, the Reich honored Bay with the Knight's Cross in May 1940. Promoted to captain the next day, he assumed command of destroyer forces in Norway. February 1942 saw him leading the destroyer screen during Operation Cerberus, the channel dash that raced Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen through the English Channel in daylight. March 1st, 1943, brought promotion to Konteradmiral. Now, December found him facing perhaps his most challenging assignment. Skilled and experienced, certainly, particularly with destroyers. The situation he inherited was far from ideal for applying that expertise, however. No preparation time replacing comets. Never commanded Scharnhorst. Never operated with this destroyer group in Arctic conditions against defended convoys. The entire operation assembled hastily, without the careful planning such a dangerous mission demanded. Historical accounts indicate both Bay and Comets had proposed using only destroyers, arguing for tactical flexibility. Including Scharnhorst would require several destroyers as protective screen, reducing those available for direct engagement with convoy escorts and merchants. Schneewind insisted the battleship participate. Her heavy guns were essential for breaking through escorts and destroying merchants quickly before British heavy units arrived. Bay's concerns reflected realistic assessment rather than cowardice. Scharnhorst's Fumo 26 radar had practical, effective range of roughly 12 to 15 nautical miles under Arctic operational conditions, heavy seas, precipitation, electrical interference. Not suitable for blind firing with any real accuracy. Often unreliable in challenging weather. British systems detected targets at 25 nautical miles and guided guns onto them beyond visual range with deadly precision. Effectiveness would be constrained to brief twilight hours around noon, perhaps 2 to 3 hours, when natural light might supplement unreliable radar. Outside that window, severe disadvantage against radar-equipped British warships, seeing and shooting accurately in total darkness. Success required timely, accurate intelligence about convoy location and British fleet positioning. That intelligence had to come from U-boats and Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Coordination between these services was notoriously problematic. Different command structures, priorities, communication procedures. Orders came regardless. December 23rd, Dönitz sent operational directives to Bay and task force commanders. Records indicate orders emphasized mission importance, stressed aggressive action against the convoy, reminded commanders of Scharnhorst's firepower advantage, while instructing withdrawal if facing superior British forces. Inherent tension between offensive action and asset preservation characterized German naval operations by this late war stage. Bay began preparations for Operation Ostfront, Eastern Front. Christmas Day approached as Scharnhorst's crew prepared for sea. Their Fumo 26 radar represented early war German technology, functional in good conditions, limited compared to British developments by late 43. Under Arctic winter operations, effective range dropped significantly from theoretical maximum. Sea clutter created false returns. Precipitation degraded performance. Extreme cold and violent motion plagued reliability. Critically, the system wasn't integrated with main gunfire control for accurate blind firing beyond visual range. British ships fired accurately at radar-only contacts, never seeing targets with human eyes. Scharnhorst needed visual confirmation or twilight conditions for effective main battery employment. Coordination problems manifested during preparations. U-boat cooperation required radio transmissions between different command structures with different cryptographic systems and operational priorities. U-boat arm wanted submarines, sinking merchants directly. Bay needed tracking and intelligence without excessive radio traffic revealing the surface forces' approach. Luftwaffe cooperation proved even more difficult. Reconnaissance aircraft from northern Norway bases had limited range in best conditions. Arctic winter weather severely curtailed capability. Fighter cover was effectively impossible, distances too great, weather too poor, coordination too complex for available resources. Scharnhorst would operate essentially alone, supported by 5 destroyers, minimal intelligence, no air cover. Norwegian resistance fighters watching the fjords noted unusual activity. Ships taking fuel and ammunition. Crews recalled from leave. Increased radio traffic. Visible preparation for sea. Trained observers recognized the signs. Information passed through clandestine networks to British intelligence, eventually reaching Admiral Fraser and his staff. Fraser adjusted force positioning accordingly. Burnett's Force 1, modified patrol coverage. Force 2, increased readiness for short-notice sailing. Ultra intercepts from Bletchley Park had already indicated Scharnhorst might sortie. Norwegian reports provided confirmation. Fraser's trap stood ready. Christmas Day arrived. No celebration awaited Scharnhorst's crew. Orders came through. Sail that evening. Men removed non-essential items that could become combat hazards or interfere with damage control. Christmas decorations put up days before, small trees, paper chains, improvised holiday cheer, went unceremoniously overboard into cold Norwegian waters. Later, civilians would find these items washed ashore, sad remnants of celebration that never happened, unintended harbingers of tragedy ahead. 1900 hours, 7 o'clock, December 25th, 1943. Scharnhorst and her destroyer escort slipped moorings, headed for open sea. Already 2 hours behind schedule. Last-minute coordination issues, final weather assessments, the complexity of readying multiple ships simultaneously in difficult conditions. 5 destroyers from the 4th and 6th flotillas formed the escort. Z-29, Z-30, Z-33, Z-34, Z-38, modern Type 19, 36 destroyers, displacing over 3,000 tons, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes. Kapitein Rolf Johannesson commanded, from Z-29. Experienced officer who knew his ships and their capabilities from months of Norwegian operations. Admiral Bay transferred his flag to Scharnhorst, establishing command aboard the battleship, rather than remaining on a destroyer, as his background might suggest. Captain Hintze commanded the ship itself, operation and fighting effectiveness. Bay commanded the task force, tactical decisions, and mission execution. Division of command, clear in theory, potentially problematic when combat demanded rapid decisions. Shortly after departure, Bay directed Hintze to push speed to 17 knots, making up lost time. They needed to reach intercept position before the convoy passed the optimal attack area. Venturing into the Barents Sea before 2300 hours, Scharnhorst surged to 25 knots, heading for open ocean. A raging gale built directly ahead. Destroyers struggled violently in heavy seas, waves crashing over bows, spray sweeping bridges, and forward guns. Crews secured anything that might break loose in the violent motion. Scharnhorst handled better, larger, heavier, but still took substantial water over her bow, despite Atlantic bow modifications made years earlier. Forward turrets trained aft, avoiding the worst water crashing aboard with each wave. Nearly due north through darkness and storm, heading for the convoy's anticipated position based on latest U-boat reports. Intelligence placed the convoy roughly 250 nautical miles ahead. At 25 knots through heavy seas, Bay anticipated possible contact by 9:30 next morning, December 26th. All night, the German force battled appalling Barents Sea conditions. Multiple forces, Bay's ships, British Force 1 and 2, Convoy JW-55B, itself, all zeroing in on the same Arctic waters. The stage was set. 6 U-boats positioned along the convoy's predicted route were experiencing severe problems. Under Captain Rudolf Peters' coordination from Narvik, the submarines formed a patrol line, hoping to intercept and attack merchant ships. Weather making surface operations difficult made submarine operations nearly impossible. U-boats detected the convoy with periscopes and hydrophones. Maneuvering into position for effective torpedo attacks proved impossible in mountainous seas, however. Submarines of that era operated primarily surfaced, diving only for attacks or evading threats. Tremendous seas made surface running dangerous and exhausting for crews. Diving to periscope depth meant losing speed, struggling against current and wave action. Either way, effective maneuvering for coordinated attacks on the well-escorted convoy was beyond capability. One frustrated commander fired a single torpedo at extreme range in poor conditions and bad geometry. Missed, disappeared into darkness and heavy seas without finding targets. Maintaining contact and tracking progress remained possible, though. Regular position reports transmitted back to U-boat command in Narvik relayed through Gruppe Nord to Admiral Bay aboard Scharnhorst. The intelligence picture Bay received was fragmentary and contradictory, common in naval operations conducted in poor conditions over vast distances. Different U-boats reported slightly different positions, struggling to maintain contact from various angles and ranges. Time delays in observation, encryption, transmission, relay, decryption, and reception meant information was outdated by minutes or hours upon arrival. Historical accounts describe communication breakdowns between U-boat command, Luftwaffe reconnaissance, and Gruppe Nord headquarters. Bay lacked clear, real-time picture of convoy location and heading. Sailing toward a target with uncertain position, through storms limiting visibility to nearly zero, with radar unable to reliably detect beyond 12 to 15 miles in these conditions. Every U-boat transmission was being intercepted. At Bletchley Park, ultra codebreakers read German naval communications with remarkable speed and accuracy, had been for years, giving Britain an intelligence advantage Germany never fully appreciated. Intercepts reached Fraser with sufficient speed for operational utility. He knew U-boats had spotted and were tracking the convoy. He could deduce Scharnhorst would use this intelligence to plot intercept course and timing. Fraser refined trap positioning accordingly. Force 1 adjusted patrol, ensuring position between Scharnhorst and convoy when Germans arrived. Force 2 positioned to close the trap once battle joined. British knew the Germans were coming, and roughly when. Germans had no idea what waited in the Arctic darkness. December 26th. Arctic darkness lightened marginally to murky twilight around mid-morning as the sun barely climbed above the horizon. Bay's force had steamed through storm all night without respite. Exhausted crew from constant violent motion and mounting combat tension. Destroyers particularly battered, their smaller size vulnerable to worst weather effects. 0500 hours, 5 in the morning. Bay radioed Johannesson, checking destroyer condition and ability to continue operations. Johannesson assured him that with favourable wind direction relative to course, they could continue. Struggling, certainly, taking water repeatedly over bows, consuming fuel faster than planned from constant high-speed manoeuvring in heavy seas. Could press on, though. New intelligence arrived from the U-boats that seemed encouraging. U-716 transmitted that earlier convoy position had been in error. Updated tracking placed it 30 nautical miles west of previous estimate. This appeared to set Scharnhorst up more favourably for intercept. Departure delay, initially disadvantageous, now seemed to have inadvertently prevented overshooting the target. Almost ideal positioning if they manoeuvred correctly. Capitalizing on this intelligence, Bay deployed destroyers forward as scouts in spread formation. Intended to position them near convoy location, where they could engage and tie down escorts with gunfire and torpedoes until Scharnhorst arrived to systematically destroy vulnerable merchants with heavy guns. Tactically sound in principle. 0800 hours, 8 in the morning. Bay made a decision historians have debated extensively for decades. Ordered the entire force to turn southwest, moving directly away from the convoy's predicted location based on latest U-boat reports. Reasoning behind this turn remains unclear and contested in historical literature. Perhaps he believed they'd overshot and needed to backtrack. Perhaps contradictory intelligence suggested the convoy was further south. Perhaps concern about destroyers bypassing the convoy entirely on their northward heading. Whatever the actual reason, truth likely died with Bay. The German force turned away from where the convoy was actually steaming. Destroyers deployed 10 nautical miles ahead in scouting line, continued search pattern at reduced 12-knot speed, slow enough to maintain formation in heavy seas while covering ground and searching for targets. Looking for smoke on the horizon, telltale signs of large merchant ship convoys. Distance between destroyers and Scharnhorst made visual signalling impossible in darkness, weather, and spray. Radio silence preferred when possible to avoid alerting British to presence and location. Coordination problem compounding as operations continued. 0830, 8:30 in the morning. Possibly reconsidering earlier decision based on updated estimates or simple uncertainty, Bay ordered Scharnhorst to turn north again toward the convoy's general area based on anticipated route. Historians note that due to distance and desire maintaining radio silence, Johannesson's destroyers remained unaware of this course change for some time. continued steaming southwest while Scharnhorst turned north, steadily opening the gap between battleship and screening force. Post-war analysis suggests breakdown in coordination, though whether from radio discipline, confusion, or other factors remains debated. Clear that tactical unity of the German force was fragmenting at a critical moment. British closed in with methodical precision based on superior intelligence and radar. Vice Admiral Burnett's Force 1, cruisers Belfast, Sheffield, Norfolk, positioned approximately 20 nautical miles east of Scharnhorst's current location, though neither side knew exactly where the other was, yet in darkness, weather, and limited radar ranges. Convoy J W-55B steamed about 20 nautical miles north-northwest of the German battleship, moving steadily eastward at around 6 knots, slowed by weather, and need keeping merchants together in tight formation for mutual protection. Fraser's Force 2 with Duke of York remained over 200 nautical miles distant, racing northward for position to deliver the killing blow. Fraser knew from ultra-intercepts and Burnett's reports where the convoy was located. Good estimate where Scharnhorst must be based on U-boat position reports Germans were using for navigation. Aboard British ships, throughout scattered forces, tension mounted steadily as contact approached. Every man knew they were closing with the enemy. Radar operators watched screens with intense concentration, waiting for the contact signaling battle's beginning. Trap ready and waiting. Prey approaching, largely blind to danger. Any moment, British radar would bridge darkness and reveal what optical rangefinders and human eyes could never see in Arctic night. The hunt was about to become battle, determining Scharnhorst's fate. The Arctic day was already dying as December 26th wore on. By early afternoon, what little twilight penetrated the Arctic winter was fading back into darkness. Scharnhorst steamed through the Barents Sea, searching for a convoy that remained frustratingly elusive. Hours had passed since departing Norway. Fragmentary U-boat reports offered contradictory positions. Admiral Bay grew increasingly uncertain about where his target actually was. Aboard HMS Norfolk, the afternoon watch maintained vigilant radar surveillance. 12, 20, 20 past noon. A new contact appeared on the radar screen. Large. Moving. Bearing northeast, range approximately 30,000 yards, roughly 16 nautical miles. The operator called it immediately. Within moments, Belfast and Sheffield confirmed identical contacts on their screens. Vice Admiral Robert Burnett felt his pulse quicken. This had to be Scharnhorst. Nothing else in these waters matched that radar signature. Her position placed her between Force 1 and Convoy JW-55B. Exactly the scenario his force existed to prevent. Orders were clear: protect the convoy at all costs. Burnett directed his cruisers to close the contact while maintaining radar tracking. Speed increased. Gun crews went to action stations. Fire control teams readied their radar-directed equipment. Range decreased steadily as both forces converged. Then the contact altered course sharply, turning away toward the southeast. Burnett made his decision. Shadow silently, maintain radar contact, but don't reveal Force 1's presence yet. Let the Germans think they're alone in the darkness. Force 1 paralleled Scharnhorst's heading, hanging back beyond visual range while radar kept the German battleship clearly visible on British screens. Optical rangefinders saw nothing but Arctic darkness and driving snow. British technology was bridging the gap that weather created. The strange pursuit continued for hours through the afternoon. Scharnhorst steaming southeast, unaware of the tracking. Force 1 shadowing from beyond visual range, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. As the brief Arctic twilight approached its peak around mid-afternoon, Burnett judged the time had come. Range had closed to roughly 13,000 yards, approximately 11.8 kilometers. Beyond visual range in the murk, yet close enough for radar-directed gunfire to be devastatingly effective. Around 16:20, 4:20 in the afternoon, Burnett gave the order. Belfast fired star shells high into the darkening sky. Brilliant magnesium light burst overhead, artificial illumination flooding the storm-tossed seas below. There. Scharnhorst, caught in the harsh light, her grey hull stark against dark water, massive and menacing, completely unprepared. British observers immediately noted the German battleship's main turrets were trained fore and aft, not positioned for immediate action. Her radar had been running passively to avoid detection. She'd been navigating through the storm using dead reckoning and fragmentary U-boat intelligence. Now she was illuminated, exposed, vulnerable. Aboard Scharnhorst, chaos erupted. Men scrambled at action stations. They'd been manning for hours in mounting tension. Turret crews worked frantically to traverse their guns toward threats they couldn't yet identify beyond the blinding star-shell glare. Officers shouted orders over the wind and the alarm klaxons. Admiral Bay and Captain Hintze struggled to comprehend what was happening. Where had these ships materialized from? How had they found Scharnhorst in total darkness? No time for answers. HMS Norfolk opened fire at approximately 16:24. Roughly 10,000 yards, just over 9 kilometers. Close range for radar-guided naval gunnery. Norfolk's 8-inch guns roared, sending heavy shells screaming through the Arctic air. Hits registered almost immediately. Scharnhorst shuddered as shells slammed into her superstructure. One struck near the forward mast area. Another hit amidships. Splinters of steel screamed through the air, cutting down men at their stations. Casualties mounted quickly. One man killed outright, several others wounded by splinters and blast effects. Blood mixed with seawater, washing across the decks from heavy seas. Multiple hits during these opening salvos damaged or destroyed Scharnhorst's forward radar and range-finding equipment. The Fumo 26 antenna array was wrecked. Forward optical rangefinders took damage. Critical fire control systems were compromised. Already inferior to British radar technology, Scharnhorst was now effectively blind beyond the limited visual range that Arctic darkness permitted. Admiral Bay made a rapid decision that would define the entire engagement. Full speed southeast. Maximum revolutions. Break contact and escape before these attackers inflicted crippling damage. Captain Hintze relayed orders to the engine rooms. Throttles opened wide. Steam pressure built rapidly in the massive turbines. Scharnhorst's speed increased, 20 knots, 22, 24, and climbing toward her maximum capability. Scharnhorst did return fire during these critical opening moments, though the response was limited and largely ineffective. Historical accounts record at least one salvo from a forward turret directed toward the British cruisers, fired as the ship accelerated and turned away. Poor visibility, damaged fire control equipment, and the confusion of being caught completely by surprise all combined to make accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The shells fell wide of their targets, raising columns of water in the darkness, but scoring no hits. Sheffield and Belfast joined Norfolk in bombardment now, their guns adding weight to the fire, hammering Scharnhorst from the darkness. Shells straddled the German battleship, massive water columns when they missed, tearing steel when they connected. Scharnhorst pulled away rapidly, her superior speed opening range even in heavy seas. She worked up past 24 knots and continued accelerating, using her powerful turbines to escape the ambush. 16:38, 22 minutes to 5. Burnett ordered ceasefire. Range was opening too quickly for effective engagement. Force One tried to pursue, but weather worked against the British cruisers now. In mountainous seas, they could manage only 16 knots without risking serious hull damage from pounding through waves at higher speed. 8-knot speed differential meant Scharnhorst gained roughly 1,000 yards every 5 minutes. By 1700 hours, 5 o'clock, Scharnhorst had vanished from British radar screens, swallowed by distance and the electronic clutter of the Arctic storm. Burnett faced a critical choice. Continue chasing a faster enemy he'd already lost radar contact with, or return to convoy protection, guarding against a second attack attempt. His cruisers were outpaced. Chasing meant leaving JW-55B vulnerable if Scharnhorst circled back for another approach. Radar contact was lost. The German battleship could be anywhere in the vast darkness. Protecting the convoy remained the primary mission. Burnett ordered Force One to reverse course and return to screening position around the merchant ships. Better to guard the convoy than chase shadows through Arctic night while leaving them exposed. Scharnhorst had escaped the first trap. Whether she'd sail into the second remained to be seen. Aboard Scharnhorst's bridge, Admiral Bay struggled to process what had occurred. Intelligence had suggested only destroyer escorts around the convoy, standard practice based on German assessments. Light forces, Scharnhorst's heavy guns, could easily sweep aside before destroying helpless merchants. Instead, he'd been ambushed by cruisers with 8-inch guns capable of inflicting serious damage. Completely unexpected. Worse, they'd found him in total darkness, using what could only be radar-directed fire, far superior to anything Germany possessed. British technological superiority was now devastatingly clear. Bay radioed Captain Johannesson to coordinate with the destroyer force. The response revealed the full extent of his coordination breakdown. 40 nautical miles now separated the destroyers from Scharnhorst. Johannesson's ships had continued southwest, while Scharnhorst turned north, then southeast, during the engagement. Distance and strict radio discipline meant neither force maintained clear awareness of the other's position. German tactical unity had completely fragmented. Standard doctrine demanded immediately ordering the destroyers to rejoin, reforming the task force for coordinated action. Bay delayed this recall order for reasons historians continue debating. Perhaps he believed he could still intercept the convoy alone. Perhaps confusion about his tactical situation overwhelmed clear thinking. Perhaps the rapid sequence of events simply exceeded his capacity to process effectively. Whatever the cause, the gap between Scharnhorst and her screening force continued widening before Bay finally ordered them to return. Distance made destroyer support highly improbable for any immediate second attempt. Then intelligence arrived that seemed to clarify the situation. U-277, shadowing the area, transmitted a convoy sighting report. Ships spotted moving east, approximately where Bay had expected to find the convoy earlier. This report was fatally incorrect. What U-277 actually observed was Commander Ralph Fisher's destroyer division, 7 warships from the 36th Division that had escorted convoy JW-55A and were now moving to reinforce Burnett's Force 1. At distance in poor visibility, the submarine commander mistook these destroyers for merchant vessels in convoy formation. Understandable error given conditions, devastating in consequences. Bay, accepting this false intelligence, deduced that the cruisers he'd just encountered were screening the convoy from the south. Working around them to the north or west might still allow intercepting the merchants before heavier British forces arrived. He decided on a second attempt. Around 17:30, 5:30, Bay set a new course designed to bypass where he believed British cruisers were positioned, circling around to reach what he thought was the convoy steaming east. Unknown to him, he sailed on faulty intelligence toward a reinforced trap that would prove fatal. Admiral Fraser's Force 2 continued racing northward to reach engagement position. Still over 200 nautical miles from the developing action, Duke of York pushed through heavy seas at maximum sustainable speed. Fraser monitored reports patiently, knowing his moment would come if Bay persisted hunting the convoy. Burnett had significantly strengthened Force 1 by early evening. Fisher's 7 destroyers, those same ships U-277 had mistakenly identified as merchants, joined the 3 cruisers, creating a formidable surface force positioned between Scharnhorst and the actual convoy location. British radar would detect any German approach long before visual contact became possible in the darkness. Scharnhorst's destroyed forward radar meant she'd stumble into Force 1 again without warning until star shells revealed her position. Around 13:40, 20 minutes to 2 in the afternoon, German flying boats on reconnaissance had spotted something crucial. Admiral Fraser's Force 2 steaming northward at high speed. 3 aircraft observed the British formation and correctly identified heavy units, likely including a battleship based on the formation's composition and the largest vessel's size. They radioed reports to Captain Peters in Narvik, intended for relay through Gruppe Nord to Admiral Schneewind and ultimately to Admiral Bay at sea. This was critical intelligence that should have prompted immediate withdrawal. Standing orders explicitly instructed disengagement if encountering superior enemy forces. A battleship certainly qualified. The information wasn't communicated to Bay for hours. Communication failures between Luftwaffe Reconnaissance, U-Boat Command, Gruppe Nord headquarters, and the Surface Task Force meant this vital intelligence remained bottlenecked in shore installations while Bay steamed on, unaware of mortal danger approaching from the south. By the time information finally reached him, if it ever did in actionable form before contact, it would be far too late to affect his fate. Scharnhorst sailed deeper into Fraser's trap, with every nautical mile steamed toward where Bay believed the convoy to be. Burnett's reinforced Force 1 waited ahead, positioned to intercept. Fraser's Force 2 closed from behind, Duke of York's 14-inch guns, ready to deliver the hammer blow that would end the hunt. Bay still believed he was hunting a lightly defended convoy. In reality, he'd become prey in a carefully orchestrated operation involving dozens of ships, superior technology, and intelligence advantages Germany couldn't hope to overcome. Afternoon faded toward evening as the brief Arctic twilight died completely, plunging the Barents Sea back into total darkness. Bay pressed his search, looking for a convoy that wasn't where intelligence suggested, sailing toward cruisers that could see him coming long before he could detect them. Scharnhorst immer vorwärts. Scharnhorst ever onwards. The motto sustaining her crew through years of war now drove them toward destruction, approaching through the Arctic night. Admiral Fraser monitored reports aboard Duke of York's bridge as his battleship raced northward through heavy seas. The trap was working perfectly. Scharnhorst hadn't broken off. She was still hunting, still searching, still moving into position where British forces could destroy her. Patience and meticulous planning were about to deliver devastating results. The second engagement approached rapidly as darkness deepened. This time, Burnett would be ready with reinforced forces. This time, Scharnhorst wouldn't escape. The lucky ship's luck was running out with every minute that passed in the Arctic darkness. Noon approached as Scharnhorst steamed northward through the Arctic darkness, searching for a convoy that remained frustratingly elusive despite hours of hunting. Admiral Bay sensed the convoy must be near based on fragmentary U-boat reports and his calculations of their likely course and speed. Time was running critically short. The brief window of Arctic twilight would soon fade back into total darkness, and with his forward radar destroyed, finding targets in complete blackness would be nearly impossible, even with optical rangefinders. He ordered a course change to southwest, hoping to position Scharnhorst to intercept the merchants he believed were steaming east just beyond detection range. Simultaneously, Bay radioed Captain Johannesson with specific instructions for the destroyer force that had been separated for hours during the chaotic morning operations. Rendezvous at a designated point by approximately 12:20, shortly after noon. The plan showed tactical logic, despite the earlier coordination failures that had fractured German unity. Position the destroyers approximately 20 nautical miles southwest of Scharnhorst's anticipated location, creating a coordinated pincer that could trap the convoy between the battleship's heavy guns and the destroyer's torpedoes and lighter weapons. If they could locate the convoy in the next critical hour, a combined assault might succeed before British heavy forces arrived to interfere. Johannesson acknowledged the orders and altered course accordingly, his 5 destroyers battling through heavy seas toward the rendezvous point. They'd been searching independently for hours now, fuel running steadily lower, crews exhausted from the constant violent motion and tension, but discipline and training held firm despite the brutal conditions. Unknown to Bay, his plan was already fatally compromised. Vice Admiral Robert Burnett's Force 1, now significantly reinforced with several destroyers from Commander Ralph Fisher's 36th Destroyer Division, had repositioned between Scharnhorst and the convoy, after breaking off the first engagement. British radar operators watched their screens with unrelenting attention, waiting for the contact they knew would likely come if Scharnhorst persisted in her determined hunt. Shortly after noon, around 12:05, HMS Belfast's radar detected a large contact approximately 13 nautical miles to the northeast, moving on a course that would bring it closer to the convoy's position. The operator called it out immediately, professional calm, barely masking the tension of knowing battle was approaching again. Within moments, Sheffield and Norfolk confirmed the contact on their own radar sets, along with the destroyer screen spread out for maximum detection coverage. Multiple ships tracking the same target with precision impossible for the Germans to match. Scharnhorst was returning for a second attempt, sailing directly toward the reinforced British force, waiting invisibly in the Arctic twilight. Burnett felt grim satisfaction mixed with professional wariness. His tactical positioning was working. Scharnhorst hadn't withdrawn to Norwegian waters after the first bloody encounter, despite taking damage. She was still hunting, still searching, still moving into the killing zone where British forces could engage her with overwhelming advantage. This time, however, Burnett commanded more ships, better tactical positioning, and complete surprise again, thanks to radar superiority that the Germans simply couldn't counter. He issued rapid orders throughout his force. Close the range deliberately. All ships prepare for action. Hold fire until he gave the explicit command. Let Scharnhorst come closer before revealing Force One's presence and position, maximizing the shock value of the ambush. Range decreased steadily as both forces steamed toward each other through the Arctic twilight, though only the British knew the collision course was developing. 13 nautical miles became 12, then 11, then 10, and still decreasing. Aboard Scharnhorst, lookouts strained their eyes, searching the horizon for any sign of the convoy they'd been pursuing for over 12 brutal hours through storm and darkness. Nothing visible but twilight gloom, driving snow reducing visibility further, and the whitecaps of heavy seas stretching to every horizon. With forward radar destroyed in the earlier engagement, the ship was effectively blind beyond a few thousand yards at most. Around 12:21, roughly 20 minutes past noon, range had closed to approximately 6 nautical miles, significantly closer than the first engagement. Burnett gave the order to spring the trap. Belfast fired star shells high into the Arctic sky, illuminating the target area with harsh artificial light. Brilliant magnesium flares burst overhead, illuminating the storm-tossed waters below with harsh white radiance that turned twilight into artificial day and exposed everything within miles. There was Scharnhorst again, caught in the pitiless light like a specimen pinned for examination. 6 nautical miles separation, much closer than the first engagement's opening range, close enough that even in heavy seas, with both forces rolling and pitching violently, accuracy would be devastating, with radar fire control compensating for the motion. Burnett ordered his ships to commence firing. Belfast, Sheffield, and Norfolk unleashed their main batteries in near-simultaneous salvos, creating a thunderous roar that echoed across the water, even above the howling Arctic wind and crashing seas. Aboard Scharnhorst, the reaction was shocked disbelief, bordering on despair. Caught again. Ambushed again in the darkness by ships she couldn't detect with her destroyed radar. How was this technologically possible? Where were these British ships hiding in the vast Arctic Ocean? The German battleship's main turrets were again not properly positioned for immediate combat engagement, trained fore and aft for steaming through heavy seas, rather than aimed at potential threats they couldn't detect approaching. Turret crews worked frantically to traverse the massive guns, electric motors, whining and straining as they swung hundreds of tons of steel and weaponry toward the threat. Too slow, far too slow to beat radar-directed fire. British shells arrived first with devastating effect. Despite the heavy seas creating extremely difficult firing conditions, both sides rolling and pitching violently through 30-foot waves, gun crews working to time their salvos between wave crests for maximum accuracy. British performance was remarkable thanks to radar fire control systems, compensating for the violent motion with electronic precision. Norfolk and Sheffield scored hits almost immediately in the opening salvos, their 8-inch shells slamming into Scharnhorst's superstructure with the impact of small automobiles travelling at supersonic speed. One shell struck the forward superstructure yet again, causing additional damage to fire control equipment already severely compromised from the first engagement hours earlier. Another hit amidships, punching through lighter plating designed to save weight to explode deep inside the ship's vitals. Scharnhorst's turret crews finally managed to get their weapons trained on target after desperate seconds of traverse. Range had closed rapidly as both forces converged on collision courses, now down to approximately 2 nautical miles, nearly point-blank range for naval gunnery, where even compromised fire control could put shells on target. This time, Scharnhorst returned fire with full fury, her crew determined to hit back. Her 11-inch main battery guns roared in anger, sending shells weighing over 700 pounds each screaming toward the British cruisers at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. The muzzle flashes lit up the Arctic twilight, enormous blooms of orange fire visible for miles in every direction. Initial salvos fell short or straddled the targets, sending up towering columns of water as shells plunged into the sea around the British ships. German gun crews adjusted their aim with practiced skill, compensating for the violent motion of both firing platform and targets and the challenging environmental conditions. HMS Sheffield took splinter damage as near misses sent fragments of shell casing and seawater spraying across her decks with the force of shrapnel. No serious penetrating hits yet, but the metal splinters wounded several men and damaged topside equipment that would need repair when the action concluded. Range continued closing as ships maneuvered aggressively through the engagement, now barely more than a nautical mile separating the combatants in a close-range knife fight. This was extremely close range for battleships and cruisers, near enough that even damaged fire control systems could put shells on target through visual ranging alone. Around 12:37, roughly 40 minutes into the engagement, Scharnhorst found HMS Norfolk's range with deadly, devastating accuracy. Multiple 11-inch shells struck the British heavy cruiser in rapid succession, the impact separated by mere seconds. The first hit knocked out one of her main 8-inch gun turrets completely, killing most of the crew inside instantly in a flash of explosive force and leaving the massive weapon disabled and silent for the remainder of the battle. The second shell penetrated deeper into the ship's vitals below the armoured deck, starting serious fires in compartments that damage control parties would struggle for hours to contain and extinguish. Casualties mounted rapidly aboard Norfolk as damage control parties rushed to contain the spreading flooding from ruptured hull plating and fight the fires threatening magazines and fuel storage. Thick smoke poured from damaged sections, mixing with the driving spray and snow to create choking conditions on deck and below. Men worked desperately in near impossible conditions to save their ship and rescue wounded shipmates from damaged compartments. Captain Hintzey, aboard Scharnhorst, observing the damage his guns were successfully inflicting, but also recognizing the extreme danger of remaining engaged with multiple radar-equipped cruisers at such close range, where they could hammer his superstructure, repeatedly made the same tactical decision as in the first engagement. Accelerate to maximum speed and break contact before accumulated British firepower could inflict crippling damage to propulsion or steering that would leave Scharnhorst dead in the water and helpless. Orders flashed to the engine room deep in the ship's hull, 28 knots, maximum sustainable speed in these brutal sea conditions without risking turbine damage. Throttles opened wide again, massive steam turbines screaming as they drove the enormous propellers through the heavy seas with tremendous power. Scharnhorst began pulling away despite the incoming fire, continuing to hammer her superstructure and upper works with shell after shell. Her fundamental speed advantage, the same technological edge that had saved her in the first engagement by allowing escape, was again proving tactically decisive against slower pursuers. Around 12:40, roughly 40 minutes past noon, the gap had widened to approximately 7 miles and was still increasing steadily as Scharnhorst's speed advantage told. Several destroyers from Commander Fisher's division attempted to close for a torpedo attack, employing the classic destroyer tactic against larger warships: get close fast, launch torpedoes at short range, escape in the confusion, and smoke before the target's heavy guns could respond effectively. They couldn't maintain sufficient speed to keep pace with Scharnhorst's 28-knot sprint through the mountainous seas, however. The destroyers, significantly smaller and lighter than cruisers, were even more severely affected by the brutal weather conditions battering all the ships. Attempting to maintain high speed in 30-foot seas risked catastrophic structural damage from pounding or even capsizing if they drove too hard into the wrong wave at the wrong angle. Fisher reluctantly ordered his destroyers to abort the torpedo run, recognizing his ships couldn't close the range sufficiently before Scharnhorst escaped beyond effective torpedo range into the protective darkness. Shortly before 12:41, Vice Admiral Burnett ordered ceasefire after a brutal engagement lasting approximately 20 minutes of sustained action. Scharnhorst was again disappearing into the Arctic darkness beyond effective gun range, her superior speed carrying her steadily away from the slower British cruisers despite their best efforts at pursuit. Belfast, Sheffield, and the damaged Norfolk ceased firing, their exhausted gun crews securing weapons and beginning the grim work of assessing damage and casualties. Burnett faced the identical decision as before, arriving at the same tactical conclusion. His primary mission remained protecting convoy JW-55B from attack, not chasing a faster opponent into the darkness where she might escape entirely or circle back for another attempt from an unexpected direction. Force 1 would return to screening the convoy, maintaining the protective barrier between Scharnhorst and the vulnerable merchant ships that remained the ultimate target. Aboard the fleeing German battleship racing south through heavy seas, Admiral Bay assessed his deteriorating situation with mounting concern and frustration. 2 major engagements in less than 6 hours. 2 complete tactical ambushes by radar-equipped forces he couldn't detect until star shells revealed his position at close range. Damage steadily mounting from multiple shell hits to superstructure and fire control systems. Forward radar completely destroyed, additional fire control equipment compromised, mounting casualties among the increasingly exhausted crew. The tactical picture was becoming painfully clear despite his earlier misconceptions about facing only light destroyer escorts. This wasn't accidental contact with scattered patrol forces. This was deliberate, carefully coordinated defense using radar technology the Germans simply couldn't match or counter effectively. Bay composed a radio message to Gruppe Nord headquarters in Norway, reporting on the second engagement and his current tactical situation for higher command awareness. Historical records indicate he described the opposition in terms that significantly overstated what he'd actually encountered, reporting being engaged by several heavy units with radar-guided fire. Whether this exaggeration was intentional, seeking to justify his failure to reach the convoy despite repeated attempts, or born of genuine confusion in the chaos of combat, remains debated by historians examining the fragmentary record. In documented fact, he'd faced 3 8-inch cruisers and supporting destroyers across both engagements, not the multiple heavy battleships or overwhelming force his message language might imply to readers at headquarters. Powerful and well-coordinated opposition equipped with superior technology, certainly, but not the massive concentration of capital ships his report suggested. What Bay didn't know, couldn't possibly know, despite reconnaissance reports that had been transmitted hours earlier but never reached him in actionable time, was that genuine overwhelming force was approaching rapidly from the southern darkness. Admiral Fraser's Force 2, with HMS Duke of York, had been closing the distance relentlessly throughout both cruiser engagements, racing northward at maximum sustainable speed through the same brutal seas. The battleship and her escorts were now less than 100 nautical miles from Scharnhorst's current position and closing the gap by several miles every hour. Fraser monitored reports from Burnett's engagements with professional satisfaction and tactical patience. His carefully laid trap was working with precision. Scharnhorst hadn't withdrawn to Norwegian safety after the first engagement, hadn't broken off and fled after the second, despite taking damage. She remained in the operational area, still within reach of Duke of York's vastly superior 14-inch main battery guns. The final, decisive act of the drama was approaching with mathematical inevitability. Scharnhorst had survived 2 hard-fought engagements with British cruisers through a combination of superior speed and heavy armour that largely shrugged off 8-inch shell hits to her armoured belt. Against Duke of York's 14-inch guns firing shells weighing 1,600 pounds at close range, that armour would prove tragically inadequate for survival. The lucky ship's extraordinary luck had finally, irrevocably run out. She just didn't know it yet as she steamed southward into the gathering darkness. 13:15, 1:15 in the afternoon. Admiral Bay made the decision that would seal his fate. Turn southeast toward Norway. The operation was over. Time to withdraw. 2 brutal engagements with radar-equipped British cruisers had convinced him that reaching the convoy was impossible without catastrophic losses. His ship had sustained damage, casualties were mounting steadily, and the enemy's technological advantage was proving overwhelming and insurmountable. Continuing the hunt would only invite more ambushes from forces he couldn't detect until star shells revealed his position at close range. Scharnhorst came about to a southeasterly heading, her bow pointing toward the distant Norwegian coast and what the crew hoped would be relative safety. Men who'd been at action stations for over 12 exhausting hours felt the course change through the ship's motion and understood its meaning. Breaking off, heading for home waters and the protection of coastal defences. Vice Admiral Burnett, monitoring Scharnhorst's movements on radar after breaking off the second engagement, made a critical decision different from his earlier choice. Pursue her this time. Wind direction had shifted during the afternoon, now blowing from astern rather than directly into the British ship's bows as it had earlier. This meteorological change had significant tactical implications that would prove crucial. Running before the wind, Force One's cruisers found they could suddenly match Scharnhorst's 28-knot pace through the heavy seas without the devastating bow pounding that had limited their speed during earlier pursuit attempts. Belfast, Sheffield, and the damaged Norfolk increased speed, maintaining precise radar contact with the fleeing German battleship while staying just beyond visual range in the deepening Arctic gloom. Commander Fisher's destroyers, smaller and typically more vulnerable to brutal weather, discovered they too could maintain higher speed with favourable wind and sea conditions. Wind and seas behind them, rather than ahead, made the violent motion more manageable, less threatening to their lighter hulls. They held formation with the cruisers, ready to exploit any opportunity that might develop for torpedo attacks. Bay's choice not to turn directly into the gale, which would have forced British cruisers to slow dramatically or risk serious structural damage, proved one of several tactical errors compounding throughout the day. Had he accepted the punishment of steaming into mountainous headseas, trading crew, comfort, and fuel efficiency for tactical advantage, he might have escaped pursuit. Instead, His southeast course gave the British relatively favourable conditions for maintaining contact. Around 13:30, 1:30, critical intelligence finally reached Admiral Bay, hours too late to meaningfully affect his decisions or tactical planning. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft had spotted Admiral Fraser's Force 2 that morning, correctly identifying heavy units, including what appeared to be a battleship. Communication breakdowns between Luftwaffe, U-boat command, and Gruppe Nord headquarters had delayed the report through multiple relay points and transmission queues spanning crucial hours. Now, Bay learned that British heavy units, possibly including a battleship, were operating somewhere in the general operational area. The information was frustratingly vague about exact positions, courses, or speeds. He had only a general notion that heavy British forces existed somewhere to his south or west, nothing precise enough for effective tactical planning, evasive manoeuvring, or informed decision-making. Admiral Fraser, by stark contrast, knew Scharnhorst's exact position through continuous reports from Burnett's radar-equipped ships and ultra-intelligence intercepts that gave him the complete tactical picture. British information superiority was total, comprehensive, and tactically decisive. 13:43, 17 minutes to 2 in the afternoon. Bay radioed orders to Captain Johannesson's destroyer force that had been operating semi-independently for hours. Make for Norway independently. Operation aborted. Each ship proceed to base as fuel and conditions allow. Johannesson's 5 destroyers had reached the designated rendezvous point earlier as ordered, finding nothing but empty ocean and deteriorating weather. They'd searched the area where Bay believed the convoy might be, sweeping back and forth through darkness looking for targets that intelligence suggested should be there. Unknown to the German destroyer crews, they'd passed within 8 nautical miles of the actual convoy, close enough that under better visibility conditions they might have spotted smoke or masts on the horizon. Arctic darkness and driving snow kept the merchants invisible meteorological chance, protecting them by mere miles from German torpedoes and guns. The destroyers turned southeast, following parallel courses to Scharnhorst, but separated by dozens of miles, each group unaware of exactly where the others were in the vast Arctic darkness that swallowed ships whole beyond radar or visual range. 14:30, 2:30 in the afternoon. Captain Hintzey addressed Scharnhorst's exhausted crew over the ship's loudspeaker system, his voice echoing through compartments and passageways. Mission aborted. Returning to Norwegian bases. Secure from action stations to standard sea watches. Rest where possible. Relief flooded through 1,600 men, despite disappointment at failing to reach the convoy after such brutal effort. They'd been at battle readiness for over 15 punishing hours, surviving 2 sharp engagements with British forces that had ambushed them repeatedly with technological superiority they had no effective counter for. Going home sounded like salvation after the day's violence and frustration. None of them knew they were being followed with predatory precision by forces that could track them clearly on radar, while remaining invisible in the darkness beyond human sight. None knew that Vice Admiral Burnett's cruisers maintained contact just beyond visual range, reporting every course change and speed adjustment to Admiral Fraser racing northward to spring the final trap. None knew the carefully prepared ambush was about to close with mathematical inevitability. 14:30 aboard HMS Duke of York, steaming north at maximum sustainable speed through heavy seas. Admiral Fraser made his calculations with the cold precision of decades of naval experience. Scharnhorst was cornered, trapped between converging forces. Continuous reports from Burnett provided exact updates on the German battleship's position, course, and speed with minute-by-minute accuracy. Fraser's navigation officers plotted intercept courses on their charts, drawing lines that showed the inevitable convergence of hunter and hunted. Fraser alerted his officers throughout Duke of York and the escorting ships. Anticipate action by approximately 16:30, 4:30 in the afternoon. Gun crews went to full action stations, though they'd been at various readiness states for hours already, waiting for this moment. Ammunition handlers positioned shells in the hoists leading to the massive gun turrets. Damage control parties checked their equipment one final time and mentally rehearsed their procedures for combat casualties. Medical teams prepared for inevitable wounded. Fraser's estimate would prove remarkably, almost eerily accurate. 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. Duke of York's Type 273 surface search radar detected a large contact 23 nautical miles to the northeast, exactly where calculations predicted. The glowing pip on the radar screen was unmistakable in size and behavior. Scharnhorst, steaming south directly toward Fraser's approaching force, completely unaware that British radar had found her from well beyond the horizon in total darkness. Fraser's tactical positioning was near perfect, the product of hours of careful maneuvering and continuous intelligence updates, creating ideal engagement geometry. Forces 1 and 2 were converging on Scharnhorst from different angles, creating an inescapable trap that would overwhelm any attempt at flight or fight. Burnett's cruisers approached from the north, maintaining their shadowing pursuit. Fraser's battleship force blocked the southern escape route to Norwegian waters and safety. More critically, Fraser had achieved the classic naval tactical advantage known as crossing the T, positioning his ship perpendicular to the enemy's course. Duke of York's course would bring her broadside on to Scharnhorst's approach, allowing all her main gun turrets to bear on the target simultaneously. 10 14-inch guns firing in devastating coordinated salvos. Scharnhorst, approaching bow-on to this threat, could only reply with her forward turrets initially, at most 6 11-inch guns, until she manoeuvred to bring her after turret to bear. Firepower advantage was overwhelming even before considering Duke of York's heavier individual shell weight and vastly superior radar fire control systems that could track and hit targets in complete darkness. Fraser's destroyers, Savage, Saumarez, Scorpion, and the Norwegian manned Stord, positioned themselves tactically for torpedo runs once range closed sufficiently for effective attack. Their role would prove critical, slow Scharnhorst with torpedo hits to her hull and machinery, preventing her from using superior speed to escape Duke of York's slower but far more powerful main battery. HMS Jamaica, the heavy cruiser accompanying Fraser's force, steamed close behind the flagship, her 6-inch guns ready to add their weight to the coming bombardment even if they couldn't penetrate heavy armour. Duke of York's radar operators reported Force 1's approach from the north as well, Burnett's ships converging on the intercept point with precise timing enabled by shared intelligence and radio coordination. British tactical coordination was flawless, all commanders working from identical information that gave them overwhelming advantage. 16:45, 4:45 in the evening. Range had closed to approximately 6 nautical miles, roughly 11 kilometres, and still decreasing steadily. Close enough for decisive action. Gun crews in Duke of York's 5 turrets had been tracking the radar contact for over 30 minutes. Fire control computers calculating range, bearing, target speed, and course continuously with electronic precision impossible for human calculation to match. They had Scharnhorst's exact position, movement vector, and projected future location, calculated and updated every few seconds. Admiral Fraser gave the order to prepare for immediate action. Final systems, checks on all weapons, and fire control equipment. Radar lock confirmed and verified. Fire control solutions computed, checked, and ready for execution. Scharnhorst sailed on through the Arctic darkness, her crew believing they were heading home to safety, unaware that the most powerful battleship in British waters had tracked them for over half an hour and now had them perfectly ranged for destruction. 16:48, 12 minutes to 5 in the evening. Star shells burst overhead, transforming Arctic night into harsh artificial day with brilliant magnesium light. For the third and final time that day, Scharnhorst was caught illuminated and exposed in blinding white light. This was the last, most devastating surprise for Admiral Bay after a day of technological ambushes. Not cruisers this time. A battleship with guns that could destroy his ship. HMS Duke of York already had Scharnhorst's range, speed, and course, calculated with precision German fire control couldn't approach. Radar had been tracking the target continuously for over 30 minutes of careful stalking. Fire control computers had refined their solutions through thousands of measurements and calculations. Gun crews had been ready for long minutes, waiting only for Fraser's order to commence firing. Fraser gave that order without hesitation. Duke of York's 14-inch guns roared with earth-shaking thunder that echoed across the Arctic Sea. 10 massive guns fired in near-perfect synchronization, hurling shells weighing approximately 1,590 pounds each, over 720 kilograms of hardened steel and high explosive across 6 nautical miles of stormy Arctic Ocean, at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. The opening salvos were devastatingly accurate, radar fire control proving its worth immediately. Scharnhorst's forward turrets took hits in the opening salvos, though exact sequencing remains debated in historical accounts. Multiple 14-inch shells struck the forward superstructure and turret areas, punching through armor not designed to withstand such heavy projectiles and detonating inside confined spaces. The forwardmost turret, Anton, in German designation, was disabled early in the engagement, its crew suffering catastrophic casualties from blast and fragmentation in the enclosed armored box that became a death trap when penetrated by such massive shells. Bruno turret also suffered damage that compromised its combat effectiveness, reducing Scharnhorst's ability to fight back with her main battery. HMS Jamaica added her 6-inch guns to the bombardment, lighter shells straddling Scharnhorst and adding to the confusion, noise, and accumulated damage even if individual hits couldn't penetrate the heavy belt armor protecting her vitals. 16:53, 7 minutes to 5 in the evening. Scharnhorst's remaining operational main battery turrets managed to return fire despite the shock, damage, and overwhelming odds against survival. Her 11-inch guns fired back at Duke of York, crew fighting desperately with courage that would earn Fraser's later respect. German gunnery showed skill despite chaos, crews well-trained and determined to hit back at their tormentor. One salvo landed close enough to Duke of York to inflict splinter damage across her superstructure from near-miss fragments. Metal shrapnel peppered the battleship's upper works, wounding several men and damaging the main search radar that had tracked Scharnhorst so effectively through the approach. The radar damage was concerning but not crippling for British operations. Backup systems remained functional, and range was now close enough that optical rangefinding could supplement electronic fire control adequately. Duke of York answered with devastating salvos that came with metronomic regularity, mechanical precision matched to destructive intent. Every 45 seconds to 1 minute, another full broadside screamed towards Scharnhorst, many shells finding their target and tearing into her superstructure and upper works with tremendous force that no ship could long withstand. 16:59, 1 minute to 5. Force 1 emerged from the northern darkness, Burnett's cruisers having closed range throughout Duke of York's opening bombardment to add their weight to the destruction. HMS Belfast opened fire, adding her 12 6-inch guns to the weight of fire falling on the surrounded German battleship. Norfolk followed despite her earlier damage from the second engagement, her remaining operational turrets joining the coordinated bombardment. Scharnhorst was now engaged on two fronts simultaneously, surrounded and outgunned, Duke of York and Jamaica hammering from the south, Belfast and Norfolk firing from the north. She fought back with desperate courage, despite impossible odds stacked overwhelmingly against her. Her after turret, Caesar, fired at Duke of York when bearing allowed, and fire control could manage solutions. Secondary battery guns engaged the cruisers with lighter 5.9-inch weapons, unable to penetrate cruiser armour at range, but forcing British ships to manoeuvre to avoid concentrated fire. Admiral Bay managed to radio a brief message to Group Nord headquarters before communications became too disrupted by damage, interference, and the chaos of combat. Historical accounts summarize his transmission as reporting engagement by heavy battleship, an acknowledgement of the desperate tactical situation he now faced. If anything, even this was understatement, rather than the exaggeration that had characterized his earlier reports. Scharnhorst faced not just one battleship, but an entire coordinated fleet, battleship, heavy cruiser, light cruisers, destroyers, all working together with technological and numerical superiority that made any outcome except destruction virtually impossible. The transmission was Bay's last communication with Shore Command and Higher Headquarters. From this point forward, Scharnhorst would fight alone and surrounded in the Arctic darkness, encircled by enemies she couldn't escape and couldn't defeat. The main gun duel continued with relentless punishing intensity, as Scharnhorst used her speed advantage to open range despite the accumulated damage from multiple hits. Duke of York's 14-inch guns fired with metronomic regularity, each salvo tearing into Scharnhorst's superstructure and upper works with tremendous destructive force. The German battleship answered when her remaining turrets could bear, her crew fighting with desperate determination, despite facing overwhelming odds from multiple directions. Belfast and Norfolk added their fire from the north, shells straddling and hitting from angles that made evasive manoeuvring nearly impossible. 17:45, 5:45 in the evening. HMS Jamaica ceased fire as range opened beyond effective reach of her 6-inch guns, her lighter weapons unable to achieve accuracy at the increasing distance. The cruisers from Force 1 followed suit shortly after, their 8-inch weapons struggling to reach accurately, as Scharnhorst employed her superior speed to steadily open the distance between herself and her tormentors, despite the damage she'd sustained. Duke of York continued firing, her superior radar allowing engagement at extreme range, where optical rangefinding was completely useless in the Arctic darkness. The Type 273 surface search radar had initially detected Scharnhorst at approximately 45,500 yards, roughly 22.8 nautical miles, demonstrating remarkable capability in nautical miles. Challenging conditions. Even at extreme range, the system could maintain tracking, though accuracy degraded significantly as distance increased and visual contact became impossible. Both sides were now essentially blind firing at muzzle flashes, the brilliant orange blooms of gun discharge visible for miles through the darkness, giving approximate bearing, if not precise range for targeting. Duke of York's radar provided significantly better information than Scharnhorst's destroyed forward systems could possibly deliver, but accuracy suffered substantially compared to the devastating precision of the opening salvos at close range. 1800 hours, 6 o'clock in the evening. Scharnhorst was pulling away steadily despite all the accumulated damage, her fundamental speed carrying her beyond effective gun range into the protective darkness that had saved her twice earlier that day. Fraser realized with mounting frustration that she might actually escape again despite everything. The faster German battleship was opening range more quickly than Duke of York could close it, even at the British ship's maximum sustainable speed through brutal heavy seas that battered all the pursuing vessels. Long minutes ticked past with agonizing slowness as the range continued increasing relentlessly. Duke of York's salvos became less frequent, fire control teams struggling to maintain solutions on a target, barely visible as a fading pip on radar at extreme range, and completely invisible to optical rangefinders in total Arctic darkness. Fraser ordered his destroyers to attempt closing for torpedo attacks, but Scharnhorst's 28-knot speed through heavy seas made effective approach impossible for the smaller warships. They couldn't maintain sufficient speed in the mountainous waves without risking catastrophic structural damage from the constant pounding. The German battleship seemed destined to escape into the vast Arctic darkness, disappearing beyond radar range just as she had twice before when Burnett's cruisers couldn't match her speed. Then, around 1820, 20 past 6 in the evening, fate intervened with devastating finality that would seal Scharnhorst's doom. A 14-inch shell from Duke of York achieved what seemed nearly impossible at such extreme range in such difficult conditions, a penetrating hit deep in Scharnhorst's engineering spaces. Historical accounts generally agree that this shell struck the lower decks and penetrated into the boiler rooms or turbine spaces, though precise mechanical details remain somewhat debated among naval historians examining fragmentary evidence. What's certain is the catastrophic effect on Scharnhorst's machinery plant and her ability to maintain the high speed that represented her only hope of escape. The hit ruptured critical steam lines carrying superheated steam under tremendous pressure to the massive turbines driving her propellers. Boiler rooms were compromised as the explosion tore through vital systems in the engineering plant. Damage propagated rapidly through interconnected machinery as engineers struggled desperately to isolate ruptured lines and maintain power to remaining functional systems. Effects on speed were immediate and devastating to any hope of survival. Speed began dropping precipitously as damaged turbines lost power and efficiency under catastrophic mechanical failure. 28 knots became 22 almost instantly as one complete turbine unit went offline from the damage. Then 20 knots as remaining systems struggled to compensate for the catastrophic loss while also dealing with flooding from hull damage. Speed continued falling as engineers desperately tried to work around ruptured lines and wrecked equipment in spaces filling with scalding steam that killed or drove men from their posts. Within critical minutes, Scharnhorst could manage barely 20 knots, and even that reduced speed was unsustainable as damage continued propagating through the compromised machinery plant. She couldn't outrun the British pursuit now. Her greatest tactical advantage, the superior speed that had saved her 3 times already that day, had been eliminated by what must have seemed to her crew like an impossibly unlucky hit at extreme range in darkness and mountainous seas. Admiral Bay understood the implications immediately, even if he didn't yet know the precise mechanical damage his engineers were fighting below. Losing speed meant losing the ability to escape, which meant facing the full accumulated weight of British firepower with no remaining option for withdrawal to safety. Death sentence pronounced by a single shell strike at the outer edge of effective range. Fraser didn't immediately realise Scharnhorst's critical speed problem, despite the fortunate hit his guns had scored into her vitals. Several minutes passed before Duke of York's radar operators noticed the crucial change developing on their screens. Range was no longer increasing steadily, as it had been for the past 20 minutes of long-range pursuit. Instead, it was holding approximately constant, then beginning to decrease slowly, as Duke of York's unchanged speed began overtaking the slowing, crippled German battleship. Scharnhorst's fundamental speed advantage was gone, eliminated by that catastrophic engineering plant hit that her crew couldn't repair under combat conditions. Duke of York and Jamaica began closing from beyond visual range, radar tracking their wounded quarry with renewed precision and growing confidence as the range decreased steadily, minute by minute. What had seemed like inevitable escape just minutes earlier was now becoming certain interception and methodical destruction. Around 1850, 10 minutes to 7 in the evening, with Scharnhorst's speed now critically reduced, Fraser ordered his 4 destroyers forward to press home torpedo attacks that had been impossible earlier when the German battleship could outrun them. Vice Admiral Burnett, observing the dramatically changing tactical situation from Force One's position to the north, detached 4 of his destroyers to coordinate attacks against the slowing target from a different angle. Commander Fisher's destroyers from the 36th Division, which had been completely unable to close earlier due to Scharnhorst's superior speed, now finally had their opportunity to strike. 8 British destroyers converged on Scharnhorst from different bearings in a coordinated pack attack that the damaged, slowing battleship had little hope of evading in her increasingly desperate condition. Fraser's 4 destroyers, Savage, Saumarez, Scorpion, and the Norwegian man Stord, arrived at effective attack position first, having been positioned closer to the developing action throughout the gun duel. They approached with professional stealth, despite the darkness and weather, using their own radar to navigate to optimal torpedo launch position, approximately 4 miles from the target, close enough for high-probability hits on a large target, far enough to minimize exposure to Scharnhorst's still dangerous secondary battery fire. Scharnhorst's lookouts and radar operators detected the threat despite the Arctic darkness and driving snow, picking up the smaller contacts approaching at high speed from multiple threatening bearings that suggested coordinated attack. Her main battery guns, those still operational after the sustained battering from Duke of York's 14-inch shells, engaged the approaching destroyers with whatever fire control solutions her damaged equipment could still provide to the gun crews. Optical range finding at night against small, fast-moving targets was extremely difficult even with undamaged systems. One 11-inch shell struck HMS Saumarez with tremendous kinetic force, a direct hit that should have utterly devastated the smaller, more lightly built warship and killed most of her crew. Incredibly, miraculously for Saumarez's crew, the massive shell failed to detonate as designed. It punched completely through Saumarez's relatively thin hull plating, entering one side and exiting the other without exploding, leaving 2 large ragged holes that immediately began flooding compartments, but didn't destroy the ship outright with blast and fragmentation. Had the shell's fusing worked as designed and detonated inside the destroyer, Saumarez would almost certainly have been blown apart and sunk with heavy loss of life. faulty fusing or defective explosives, saved her crew from catastrophic destruction by pure chance. The destroyers pressed their coordinated attacks despite the close-range fire from Scharnhorst's increasingly desperate gunners fighting to keep the smaller warships at bay. Torpedoes launched from multiple ships at carefully staggered intervals to saturate the target's ability to maneuver, white wakes streaking through the dark water toward the massive battleship that couldn't dodge effectively with her damaged, flooding machinery spaces. 3 torpedoes connected with Scharnhorst's starboard side in rapid succession over a span of perhaps 30 seconds. The distinctive massive underwater explosions sending violent shudders through both the stricken battleship and the attacking destroyers that felt the concussions transmitted through the water and their own hulls. The resulting flooding was utterly devastating to any remaining hope of survival or escape. Torpedo warheads exploding against the hull below the waterline tore massive irregular holes through steel plating that let thousands of tons of freezing Arctic seawater pour uncontrollably into compartments never designed to remain watertight after such catastrophic multiple breaches in quick succession. Damage control parties worked with frantic desperation to shore up weakened bulkheads and seal what could possibly be sealed, but the sheer volume of flooding overwhelmed their capabilities and available equipment. Speed reduced even further to barely 10 knots as progressively flooded compartments and critically damaged machinery robbed Scharnhorst of any remaining mobility or maneuverability. She was now effectively dead in the water relative to tactical requirements, a nearly stationary target that could barely move and could only fight back with whatever weapons systems remained operational after the sustained punishment. The British destroyers withdrew skillfully to safer distance beyond effective range of secondary batteries, their critical mission thoroughly accomplished. They'd slowed Scharnhorst to the point where she couldn't possibly escape, couldn't maneuver to avoid incoming fire, could barely defend herself against the overwhelming force closing in from multiple directions. The grim job of finishing her methodically now fell to Duke of York and the cruisers closing remorselessly on the crippled, dying target. Just after 1900 hours, shortly past 7 o'clock in the evening, Duke of York's fire control radar was repaired sufficiently to resume accurate tracking and fire control solutions after the earlier splinter damage from Scharnhorst's near-miss salvo had temporarily degraded its performance. Fraser manoeuvred his battleship deliberately to unmask the after turret that had been partially blocked by superstructure, bringing all operational main battery guns to bear on the target, now barely capable of any evasive action whatsoever. Range had closed to approximately 6 nautical miles, point-blank range for battleship gunnery, where even significantly damaged fire control systems could achieve devastating accuracy against a large, nearly stationary target. The final, relentless assault began in earnest, no longer a running gun battle, but a systematic, methodical execution of a doomed opponent. Duke of York's 14-inch guns fired salvos every 45 to 60 seconds with mechanical precision that never faltered, each full broadside hurling multiple tons of hardened steel and high explosive across the dark water into Scharnhorst's increasingly battered and burning superstructure. The range was close enough that optical range finding could effectively supplement radar fire control, giving the British devastating combined accuracy even in total Arctic darkness. 19:15, 7:15 in the evening. HMS Jamaica rejoined the systematic bombardment, her 6-inch guns able to reach effectively at the significantly reduced range, as she closed boldly to support Duke of York's assault with her lighter but still damaging weapons. Belfast also closed range aggressively and added her 12 6-inch guns to the terrible weight of fire now falling on Scharnhorst, from multiple directions simultaneously with no respite between salvos. Norfolk remained at somewhat longer range due to her earlier combat damage from the second engagement, but contributed what fire her remaining operational turrets could still provide to the combined bombardment. Duke of York's massive 14-inch shells still couldn't penetrate Scharnhorst's thick armoured belt, protecting her vitals and internal machinery spaces. That heavy armour had been designed specifically and successfully to defeat shells of this caliber at typical battle ranges. The shells devastated absolutely everything above the armoured belt, with horrifying systematic effectiveness, however. Superstructure was methodically demolished from the top down as shell after shell burst against or penetrated the lighter plating designed primarily to save weight rather than provide meaningful protection against heavy caliber bombardment. Command spaces were progressively wrecked, fire control positions systematically destroyed, communication systems comprehensively shattered. Heavy casualties mounted steadily as 14-inch and 6-inch shells exploded repeatedly in spaces crowded with men trying desperately to keep their dying ship fighting to the very end. Scharnhorst continued returning fire when tactical circumstances allowed, and her progressively damaged systems could still manage it. Her surviving crew, fighting with extraordinary courage and discipline, despite knowing with absolute certainty that their situation was utterly hopeless. Once visual range closed sufficiently despite the darkness, her remaining operational turrets fired back at the British ships, systematically hammering her to pieces. The forward Anton turret had been destroyed early in the engagement, its crew mostly killed in the initial salvos. Bruno turret fired under local control only after centralized fire control systems were progressively destroyed by accumulated hits. Individual gun crews manually aiming and firing with whatever crude solutions they could calculate from inside the increasingly damaged armoured turret without external support. 1920, 7:20 in the evening. Bruno turret was finally knocked out completely by concentrated direct hits that wrecked its remaining mechanisms beyond any possibility of repair, and killed the surviving crew members still fighting their guns inside the steel coffin. Only the after turret, Caesar, continued answering the overwhelming British bombardment, its determined crew working their guns with grim professionalism as their ship was systematically destroyed around them by forces they couldn't hope to defeat. 1930, 7:30. Caesar turret finally exhausted its entire ready ammunition supply after firing every available shell that could possibly be brought to the guns through the progressively wrecked ship's damaged interior. Only the secondary battery remained functional, 5.9-inch guns originally designed for fighting destroyers and light cruisers, utterly inadequate against battleships and heavy cruisers at any tactical range. Centralized fire control had been comprehensively destroyed by the sustained, systematic bombardment from multiple directions, forcing each remaining secondary gun to operate completely independently under local control with whatever minimal targeting information individual crews could obtain from their isolated positions. Cruiser and battleship caliber shells continued raining down relentlessly from multiple bearings, making any form of effective, coordinated return fire essentially impossible for the surviving gunners. The secondary guns were functionally useless against armour. They had no hope of penetrating, and fire control systems they couldn't possibly match with their crude local aiming. But Scharnhorst's surviving crew continued fighting with whatever remained, because fighting was all that was left to them as their ship died. The final end was approaching with terrible, inexorable inevitability. Captain Fritz Hintze stood on Scharnhorst's shattered bridge as his ship died around him. Commanding a heavy warship had been his childhood dream, the ambition that drove him to join the Navy in 1920. 23 years of service, rising through the ranks, all leading to this pinnacle, command of one of Germany's most powerful battleships. Now that dream was being shot out from under him by overwhelming force he couldn't counter or escape. Around 1920, shortly after 7 in the evening, Hintze composed what would be his final message to Gruppe Nord headquarters. Historical records indicate the transmission expressed determination to fight to the end and loyalty to Germany and the regime they served, though exact wording varies across sources. The message reflected the grim resolve of men who knew they were doomed but refused to surrender. Scharnhorst was a scene of progressive destruction no ship could survive. Damaged from dozens of shell hits, burning in multiple locations, listing noticeably to starboard as flooding from torpedo impacts compromised her stability. She traced a slow, wide circle through the water, damaged rudder and asymmetric flooding, making controlled steering nearly impossible. A flaming wreck, yet somehow still afloat despite everything British guns and torpedoes had inflicted. The British wouldn't let her remain that way. For Admiral Fraser and his officers, this was vengeance for years of losses. Scharnhorst had sunk HMS Glorious and her destroyer escorts with terrible casualties in June 1940. She'd obliterated HMS Rawalpindi in November 1939. Her commerce raiding had destroyed dozens of merchant ships. Fraser ordered HMS Jamaica and Belfast forward for close-range torpedo strikes against the crippled battleship. Commander Fisher positioned his destroyers for coordinated attacks from different angles to saturate any remaining defences. What followed was less battle than execution, a methodical finishing of a mortally wounded opponent that refused to die easily. The cruisers and destroyers launched numerous torpedoes in quick succession over the final phase of the action. Historical accounts record that Jamaica and Belfast fired torpedoes from close range, followed by concentrated destroyer attacks that launched approximately 19 torpedoes in rapid salvos from multiple ships. Several torpedoes struck home with massive underwater explosions that sent violent shudders through every nearby vessel. The exact number of hits and which ships scored them remains debated among historians, examining fragmentary battle reports, but the accumulated torpedo damage was utterly catastrophic beyond any possibility of survival. Around 1940, 40 minutes past 7, Captain Hintze gave the order every naval officer dreads. Abandon ship. For many of Scharnhorst's crew, escape was fantasy rather than realistic possibility. The ship was sinking rapidly, settling deeper as flooding consumed compartment after compartment faster than bulkheads could contain it. Icy Arctic waters, hovering just above freezing, consumed the ship from below, rising through deck after deck with terrible speed. Below decks, countless sailors found themselves trapped as escape routes were cut off by flooding, jammed hatches, wreckage blocking passageways, or simply being too deep in the hull to reach topside before water reached them. For those who reached the exterior decks, the Arctic's merciless embrace awaited with conditions that made survival measured in single-digit minutes. Scharnhorst rolled progressively onto her starboard side, as asymmetric flooding destroyed what remained of her stability. Her massive propellers were still turning slowly, damaged turbines continuing to drive the shafts even as the ship capsized, a mechanical death reflex that made approaching the stern suicidally dangerous for anyone in the water. She began her final descent into the abyss, sliding beneath the surface bow first as progressive flooding pulled her down, despite air trapped in some sealed compartments. Around 1945, approximately 7:45 in the evening on December 26, 1943, Scharnhorst vanished beneath the freezing, churning waves of the Barents Sea. Men trapped below decks died by the hundreds as compartments flooded completely, drowning in total darkness as lights failed and icy water filled spaces in seconds. For those who made it outside, survival prospects were only marginally better. Arctic waters so cold that unprotected immersion meant rapid death from hypothermia within 10 to 15 minutes at most. Swimming became a Herculean feat as muscles cramped and coordination vanished. A few life rafts and pieces of flotsam provided temporary refuge that might extend survival by precious minutes. Only a handful of men managed to escape the ship and evade the powerful suction as her massive hull plunged toward the bottom. The once mighty battleship was gone, taking most of her crew into the depths. The lucky ship's luck had finally run out. British destroyers immediately began searching for survivors. Professional naval courtesy extended even to enemies who'd fought to the bitter end. They found a scene of almost unimaginable horror. Oil-slicked waters stretching for hundreds of yards, fuel from Scharnhorst's ruptured bunkers spreading in a toxic slick that made breathing difficult and swimming nearly impossible. Wreckage floating everywhere, pieces of superstructure, equipment, personal effects. Bodies, most already dead from hypothermia, drowning, or wounds sustained during battle. The few living survivors were in desperate condition, hypothermic to the point of unconsciousness, covered in fuel oil, many wounded. Destroyer crews worked frantically to get these men out of the killing water, hauling them aboard with lines and nets, applying whatever first aid was possible. From Scharnhorst's crew of approximately 1,968 men, only 36 survived to be rescued from the Arctic waters. 36 survivors from nearly 2,000. The arithmetic of catastrophe. Among the lost were Konteradmiral Erich Bay and Captain Fritz Hinze. Both went down with their ship, along with nearly every officer and most of the crew. Estimating exact casualties presents challenges due to incomplete records, but conservative counts suggest at least 1,932 men perished. Some estimates approach or exceed 2,000. The true toll will never be known with certainty. Admiral Fraser, receiving confirmation that Scharnhorst had sunk, composed a succinct message to the Admiralty in London. Scharnhorst sunk. The Admiralty's response was equally brief. Grand. Well done. No crew of a fighting warship takes pleasure in seeing enemy sailors subjected to the horror of a sinking in Arctic waters. Professional respect transcends national allegiance when ships and men go down. Fraser later addressed his officers with words reflecting this professional ethos. Historical accounts record him expressing hope that if any of them were called upon to lead against vastly superior forces, they would command their ships as gallantly as Scharnhorst had been commanded that day, fighting to the end despite impossible odds. It was perhaps the highest compliment one naval officer could pay another, even an enemy. Scharnhorst's sinking marked a pivotal strategic shift in the Arctic theatre. With Tirpitz already crippled by British midget submarine attack, the last major German surface threat to Arctic convoys had been eliminated. The convoy routes to Soviet ports would see no more interference from German capital ships after December 26, 1943. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet had been effectively neutralized as a strategic force. Scharnhorst's destruction resulted from multiple converging factors: British tactical expertise and careful planning, overwhelming technological superiority in radar and fire control, superior intelligence from ultra-code breaking and Norwegian resistance, and crucially, overwhelming numbers that Scharnhorst couldn't overcome alone. The odds had been stacked against her from the moment she sortied from Norwegian waters. Still, her valiant resistance echoed the stand of Bismarck before her, both ships ultimately outmatched by the Royal Navy's combined might, both crews fighting to the bitter end despite knowing the battle was lost. Convoy JW-55B proceeded safely to Soviet ports, reaching its destination on December 29th without loss. The supplies it carried would help sustain the Soviet war effort on the Eastern Front. The triumphant British vessels returned to home ports, to heroes' welcomes, their achievement resonating globally as a significant Allied victory. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all sent congratulations on the successful operation. Germany confronted the grim news of Scharnhorst's loss on December 29th. Grand Admiral Dönitz found it convenient to blame Admiral Bay for the disaster, easy since Bay wasn't alive to defend his decisions. The strategic cards had been stacked against Bay from the outset: inadequate intelligence, technological inferiority, overwhelming enemy forces, communication failures, and orders demanding results without providing means to achieve them safely. Today, Scharnhorst rests on the floor of the Barents Sea, a tomb for the hundreds who never escaped her sinking hull. Scharnhorst immer vorwärts, Scharnhorst ever onwards, until the Arctic darkness and overwhelming force finally stopped her forever. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. British destroyers scoured oil-slicked waters for survivors, finding wreckage, lifeless bodies, and only 36 shivering men plucked from the Barents Sea's killing grip. Konteradmiral Bay and Captain Hintze were not among them. Fraser's message to the Admiralty captured the moment with characteristic understatement: Scharnhorst sunk. The response: grand, well done. Later, Fraser told his officers he hoped if they ever faced superior forces, they would command as gallantly as Scharnhorst had been commanded that day, the highest compliment one naval officer could pay another. From nearly 2,000 men, only 36 survived. The exact toll remains uncertain, estimates ranging from 1932 to over 2,000 lost. Scharnhorst's destruction marked the end of German surface threats in Arctic waters. With Tirpitz crippled, no capital ships remained to challenge the vital convoys. Convoy JW-55B reached Soviet ports safely on December 29th. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sent congratulations. British crews returned to heroes' welcomes. Dönitz blamed Bay, conveniently, since Bay couldn't defend himself. The odds had been stacked from the start: inadequate intelligence, inferior technology, overwhelming force. Speculation remains about that catastrophic hit around 1820 that destroyed Scharnhorst's machinery. Had it missed, she might have escaped like Bismarck before her. Fate came down to one shell at extreme range. Today, Scharnhorst rests on the Barents Sea floor, tomb for hundreds who never escaped. The lucky ship's luck had finally run out. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. British destroyers scoured oil-slicked waters for survivors, finding wreckage, lifeless bodies, and only 36 shivering men plucked from the Barents Sea's killing grip. Conter-Admiral Bay and Captain Hinsey were not among them. Fraser's message to the Admiralty captured the moment with characteristic understatement: Scharnhorst sunk. The response? Grand. Well done. Later, Fraser told his officers he hoped, if they ever faced superior forces, they would command as gallantly as Scharnhorst had been commanded that day, the highest compliment one naval officer could pay another. From nearly 2,000 men, only 36 survived. The exact toll remains uncertain, estimates ranging from 1932 to over 2,000 lost. Scharnhorst's destruction marked the end of German surface threats in Arctic waters. With Tirpitz crippled, no capital ships remained to challenge the vital convoys. Convoy JW-55B reached Soviet ports safely on December 29th. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sent congratulations. British crews returned to heroes' welcomes. Dönitz blamed Bay, conveniently, since Bay couldn't defend himself. The odds had been stacked from the start: inadequate intelligence, inferior technology, overwhelming force. Speculation remains about that catastrophic hit around 1820 that destroyed Scharnhorst's machinery. Had it missed, she might have escaped like Bismarck before her. Fate came down to one shell at extreme range. Today, Scharnhorst rests on the Barents Sea floor, tomb for hundreds who never escaped. The lucky ship's luck had finally run out.